The story of our hero begins with a spaceship cutting through the vast expanses of space, where he came to his senses among a pile of cold metal and immediately realized that he had become a hostile alien creature in the sci-fi survival game Space Survival. It was a fairly popular RPG game in which you had to choose one of the various races that inhabited the vast space in order to survive, develop, and explore outer space. In this game, from time to time, our hero chose the role of a metal gremlin and ate human ships. And sometimes he was a mutated, bloodthirsty monster and destroyed enemies in ground battles. Once he even attacked an entire planet and managed to take a leadership position in a group of collective battles. Throughout his entire adult life, Edgar has played as all sorts of space creatures that seem to come out of the most terrifying nightmares. But among all of them, our hero had one species that he was most attached to: unidentified hostile cosmic matter, or UHCM for short. Edgar named his favorite character Amorphous. He was created in the image and likeness of the creature from the movie Alien. This species was distinguished by the fact that it was able to infinitely strengthen itself with the help of genetic information obtained from their victims. Although at first glance it might seem like a scam, there was a significant downside. Due to the incredible difficulty of survival, it was impossible to achieve dialogue and cooperation with other races. The reason why this race was Edgar's favorite was quite simple. This species could freely evolve and become stronger, depending on its choice and will, and this is what won him over. Now our hero was studying the blue system window in front of him, which said that he was a child of the NVCam race. So far, his only skill was hypersensitivity, and his primary goal was survival. Edgar studied the window for several long minutes, still not fully believing that it was real. Coming out of his stupor, he began to examine his new body. After examining his short paws, Edgar sighed tiredly and plopped down on the floor. Although he really liked the alien, playing a game and becoming like the monsters in reality was very different. Deciding that now was not the best time to think, Edgar began to look around, studying the situation. Suddenly, his whole body began to itch like hell, and rolling onto his back, he began to desperately tear his skin with his paws. Several agonizingly long minutes later, the old skin peeled off, freeing him from his torment. But Edgar was terribly exhausted. He could not even imagine that peeling off the skin was such a painful process. Having regained his strength a little, he realized that he needed to get some food. With these thoughts, he rushed to study this compartment, completely filled with iron containers and boxes. After examining the room he was in, Edgar came to the conclusion that its shape was very similar to a mega corporation or a star union, so he needed to be extremely careful. If he was noticed, he would be killed immediately. The hero decided to test what his ability of supersensitivity was capable of. Light green waves of energy began to radiate from his body, thanks to which he could see what was inside the boxes and crates located in this room. New images kept appearing in his head, which Edgar carefully studied. He was extremely focused and tried to find at least something resembling food. A couple of minutes later, he finally found what he was looking for and immediately rushed from the spot. After running past several boxes, he jumped onto a green one in which he found food. A little ahead, he noticed a field for entering a password to open this box, and was very happy that they required a password here, and not something else, and he should not have any problems with this. Edgar entered the first password that came to mind: 1, 2, 3, 4, and was extremely surprised when the box mechanism began to open, although he was pleased with how easily he was able to solve this problem, but the stupidity of the one who set this password. When the container opened completely, Edgar saw a variety of different bars in front of him. He took one of them and tore open the packaging. After that, he immediately bit off a large piece of it and swallowed it even while chewing. Although it tasted like a rubber eraser, he had no other choice to somehow get his fill. Suddenly, a cockroach ran past him. This did not go unnoticed by Edgar, who immediately set his tail after the cockroach. He was pierced through and through by his pointed tail. The hero brought his prey closer and examined it with a careful gaze. Afterwards, he threw the caught cockroach into his mouth, and to his great surprise, it turned out to be quite tasty, certainly much better than those bars. Suddenly, the familiar system window appeared in front of him again, in which it was written that the predator effect had been activated and the acquisition of genetic data had been successful. The wings had passed on to him from the consumed cockroach, and now Edgar was offered to use the received attribute. After reading this, our hero was incredibly happy that he managed to obtain such a valuable gene in a relatively short period of time, because genetic numbers were a key element of Amorph's work. Because the more genetic information he obtains, the stronger he becomes and is even able to evolve into stronger creatures. A joyful smile appeared on Edgar's face, but he himself could not believe his luck. Without a moment's hesitation, he accepted the system's tempting offer by clicking the yes button. At the same moment, changes began to occur in his body, and two small growths appeared on his back. They quickly developed into a full pair of wings. Edgar glanced behind him, checking how his new limbs looked. The hero wanted to test his wings in practice, but he ran into a problem. He didn't know how to control them. Lowering his head onto his paws, he began to think that since the wings are on his back, it turns out that he should feel as if he were moving the trapezius muscle. The hero tensed his entire body, deciding to test this theory in reality. The next moment, he jumped into the air and immediately tried to flap his wings with all his might. But he didn't last even a couple of seconds before he fell back down. Immediately after that, he began to devour the disgusting tasting bars one after another. Using the wings turned out to be a much more energy-consuming process than Edgar had expected. In an instant, another pair of cockroaches ran below, past the container on which our hero was sitting. He immediately noticed them, and the thought matured in his head that in order to use the wings correctly, he needed to have all the necessary abilities. Edgar quickly swooped down and pierced one of them with his tail. After that, he immediately sent it into his mouth. So for a couple of minutes, he caught cockroaches running past. But even when he ate the 20th, he did not notice any result, and this greatly disappointed him. At the moment when he was finishing his next victim, a blue window of the system appeared in front of him. It said that in addition to oversensitivity and wings, another skill had been added: chitinous shell. Edgar was glad that he had received a skill that increased his defense level, but he was worried that it would be quite difficult for him to obtain strong survivability stats. From the game, he knew that vitality was a characteristic that slowed down aging by reducing energy consumption, most often found in passive insects and plants. These characteristics significantly reduced the need to cling to food. The hero began to look around in search of his new victims, because in order to pump up his survivability, he needs to catch and eat as many cockroaches as possible. But not finding anyone, he decided to change tactics and jumped onto one of the boxes again. Having climbed as high as he could, he jumped into the air. This time, controlling the wings was much easier for him, so he flew easily over the base and looked attentively for his new targets. A few moments later, luck smiled on him and he noticed two more cockroaches, completely unaware of their fate. One of them stopped, noticing a strange shadow above him. Edgar took advantage of this and attacked him, grabbing the cockroach with both paws. He immediately bit off his head to get rid of any unnecessary resistance. As he finished chewing on its body, he watched as the other cockroach quickly crawled away. Our hero had no intention of letting his target escape, so he rushed after him with burning eyes. But because his body was too big compared to the cockroaches, he couldn't squeeze between the two containers where the cockroach was hiding and simply flew into them, painfully hitting his head on their surface. Tears came to his eyes from the pain, and he kept his displeased gaze fixed on the cockroach. Edgar had no intention of giving up, so he pointed his long tail in an attempt to reach the nimble insect. He succeeded. The sharp tip of his tail caught its target, piercing it right through. This cockroach suffered the same fate as all the others. Its body was sent into Edgar's mouth. All that was left of him were a pair of paws that had fallen to the ground. As soon as the hero ate it, a message appeared in front of him stating that the predator reaction had been activated. He managed to get one of the biological properties of cockroaches: vitality, and now he was offered to use this skill. The hero pressed the yes button without the slightest hesitation. His body immediately began to change. The muscles in his paws became much stronger. In addition, the back muscles also became stronger and small. Spiky growths appeared along the spine. All the changes that happened to him made our hero incredibly happy. He looked at his renewed body with a satisfied look. Suddenly, he felt vibrations coming from behind the wall and the barely perceptible sound of footsteps. Our hero understood that the owners of this ship, the people, were his enemies, and in order to survive their collision, he needed to go through the cub stage as quickly as possible. So he needed to step outside the cargo bay and continue his hunt there. When asked where he should go now, he already knew the answer, so he headed there without delay. He crawled along the wall towards the ventilation section. Edgar thought that the cold storage room next to the radiation section would be a good place because it was a fairly important facility, and there shouldn't be many visitors there. While unscrewing the bolts from the ventilation hole, the hero decided that even if his hopes were not justified, he could simply break the reactor along with the cooling chamber and run away from here. A couple of minutes later, he had removed all the screws and looked inside. The hero looked around, checking the ventilation for safety, and climbed inside. But as soon as Edgar climbed up there, a powerful stream of wind from the fan immediately rushed onto the sand. In the first seconds, this scared our hero quite a bit. Edgar moved close to the fan and began to unscrew the bolts. And then, a few moments later, the grate with the loud chair fell to the floor. The hero cast an appraising glance at the fan, thinking about his next step. He understood that if the fan was broken, then people would immediately receive a message about it. So the only possible option left to him was to slip at the right moment, avoiding the blades. To do this, he decided to resort to the help of Amorph's abilities. His analytical abilities and sensitivity had increased significantly, so he realized that the fan wings were slowing down at some point because they were already quite worn out. Edgar timed one of those moments. A moment later, he jumped up with determination and flew forward. Due to the strong wind flow, he had to put in much more effort than usual to get closer. He managed to slip past successfully. At the last moment, the fan's wing only touched the tip of his tail. Edgar quickly rushed on, flying as far away from the fan as possible. Only when he was safe was he able to breathe a sigh of relief, glad to be alive. Afterwards, he crawled further forward towards his goal. Several long minutes later, Edgar froze as he heard voices below. He carefully approached the bars, peering through them into the room. There, the hero noticed two men, whose faces showed strong discontent, and they themselves were discussing another failed experiment and what they would get in trouble with from the boss again. After analyzing their conversation, Edgar realized that this was an experimental laboratory, which surprised him greatly, because he thought that this was an ordinary spaceship. But even this discovery did not dissuade him from the assumption that the members of this board were supporters of the Mega Corporation. A Mega Corporation is a separate race that was founded in the likeness of earthly people. And here, instead of a government, several large corporations dominate. Most of their members are materialists. Although many races hold a neutral position, the Mega Corporation is closer to the side of evil. Edgar knew that this was the only place where a person was turned into a slave. After waiting for these people to come out, he unscrewed the bolts from the grate and flew into the laboratory. The hero landed on the floor, deciding to explore what could be interesting here. He immediately activated his amorphous ability, thinking that depending on what kind of spaceship it was, it would change its appearance. If this turns out to be the Hulk's mutation research facility, then Edgar would have chosen a mutant soldier who specialized in ground combat because it would give him a steel body and excellent fighting abilities. In the laboratory where they experiment with the superpowers of the space elf cult, you can get a special, powerful psychedelic gift. The hero himself would like to be on the side of the cult. He was distracted from his thoughts by someone's quiet voice pleading for help. The hero walked forward a little and cautiously peered out from behind his shelter. In front of him, he saw a huge flask, inside of which was a light pink ball asking for help. From it stretched many different wires. Approaching, Edgar read the inscription and learned that it was a bubble amoeba. It also stated that her specialty was to conserve oxygen, which disappointed him greatly because it was the most useless skill for Amorph. He decided not to dwell on this and to look for more clues using his hypersensitivity. Suddenly, electrical discharges began to emanate from the amoeba's body, and Edgar suggested that perhaps this was what the researchers had been talking about. Afterwards, he turned his gaze to the device and reached for the yellow button. Based on the information he had received from the hypersensitivity, he was sure that if he pressed this button, the experiment would end. His guess turned out to be correct. The electricity enveloping the amoeba's body dissipated almost immediately, and the amoeba itself thanked Edgar. Before he could do anything else, he heard someone's footsteps approaching, and this frightened him greatly. The hero instantly soared into the air, hastily looking for a place where he could hide. Thus, he flew to the very top shelf with various bottles. At that very moment, the front door slid to the side. A girl immediately entered the laboratory. Holding the cat in her arms, Alexa asked the confused man behind her with displeasure when the 26th experiment would finally give results. He replied that at the moment only a little progress was noticeable, so they needed a little more time. She stopped abruptly and, looking at him with the same displeasure, said that she needed to report the results to the company before she arrived at her destination. When Alexa said that if they couldn't achieve the desired result, the company would have to reconsider the fact of their work and presence here, Adam was truly horrified because he understood perfectly well that her words were not just threats. Stammering with fear, he began to beg her for mercy. Alexa stepped forward a little and said that she didn't want it to end like this either, so she would look forward to the results of the experiment. She also added that if Adam manages to achieve significant results, the position of chief researcher will no longer be a pipe dream for him. The man couldn't believe his ears and asked if this was really true, to which the girl replied that in addition to this, he would even have the opportunity to collaborate with Mars, because they were very interested in this project. Adam listened to her attentively, thinking over everything she said. When he suggested using ammonium, a look of surprise crossed Alexa's face. She stroked the head of the cat lying in her arms and thoughtfully said that they had never used the awakening drug produced by the Star Union before. Afterwards, she looked closely at the flask and said that she had already gone through all the possible ingredients, and perhaps Ionium really was their only option. Nodding, Alexa ordered Adam to get to work right away, which caused the man to become confused and hesitantly replied that if the subject ingested the neutralizer, it would interfere with the life support system. Edgar, however, had been watching these two closely all this time, without giving away his presence in any way. Alexa put pressure on Adam and he had to comply. He began to gradually inject the amoeba with 1/100th of a milligram of the drug. When he reached 5/100ths, they finally saw a reaction. The amoeba's body began to tremble slightly. Alexa had a satisfied expression on her face and said that since there was a reaction, she could increase the dose and introduce everything, which caused even more confusion in Adam. He tried to object to her, but the girl simply pushed him away and pressed the right button herself. A high concentration of the drug was instantly introduced into the body of the amoeba through tubes attached to it. Her body began to undergo mutations, and she began to desperately beg for help, experiencing hellish pain. Alexa, watching this, smiled contentedly and waited impatiently to see what would happen. Edgar was also watching, but he had a completely opposite feeling because he heard these desperate cries for help. A minute later, it was all over, and the girl thoughtfully looked at the results she had received. Without taking her eyes off the amoeba's whitened body, on which small growths had appeared, hinting at the appearance of limbs in the future, she said that they needed to interact more with number 26. Afterwards, she ordered Adam to immediately inform her if any significant results appeared. He bowed and replied that he would certainly inform her about everything. Suddenly, something caught her attention, and she turned around sharply. Alexa looked carefully at the shelf behind her, trying to find something or someone there. But not finding anyone, she wrote it off as just her imagination and headed for the exit. Edgar was very alarmed by what had just happened. The fact that this girl was able to sense him scared him a lot, and he was left with a very bad feeling. So he decided that he had to get rid of her in a couple of days, no matter what. Having escaped from the laboratory, our hero entered another place where the possibility of being discovered by someone was zero and hid there for a while. It devoured the liquid that flowed through the ship's many wires. When Edgar had eaten enough, he decided to take action. Closing his eyes, he concentrated, activating his hypersensitivity. Thanks to the liquid he had absorbed, every part of the ship felt like one whole with our hero. He was guided by the rule that he who has information has peace. And now he intended to find out where and what his enemies were doing, as well as all the information about their negotiations, in order to win this war. On his 4th day of life as an amorph, he discovered this place and decided to establish his nest here. After which the hero walked back and forth between the nest and the cargo compartment for several more days. Along the way, he caught and ate cockroaches along with spiders, while he managed to spy and collect information. While observing the researchers, he noticed that they came to the laboratory at the same time every day. And every time there was Alexa there, who, as he had managed to find out, was the head of the research group on this ship, although she herself was weak in body, but was the most important figure on board and represented an immediate danger to him. There was even a case when one of the test subjects managed to escape. While other researchers were confused, she managed to catch the escapee by creating a special tracking device in just 2 hours. Each time he was more and more amazed by the fact that for an ordinary person, Alexa had quite good abilities and clearly had the makings of psychedelic powers. It was a skill common to all races, a power similar to superpowers such as psychokinesis, telepathy, and mental control. However, very rarely among humanity have individuals been found who were born with strong psychedelic potential. While chewing another candy bar, Edgar reasoned that regardless of Alexa's talent, the current situation was one of those where armed soldiers were always right. Suddenly, a blue system window appeared in front of him, from which our hero learned that he had acquired another skill: paralyzing sting. This ability seemed extremely useful to him, because he couldn't use anything he had before to attack. Edgar was confident that his poison was capable of defeating at least one adult human. Immediately after that, he began to think of a plan on how he could create a situation where he would be left alone with the enemy and use his sting, because the soldiers were always nearby and would attack him faster than he could do anything. Taking another candy bar in his paws, he decided that if he continued to just rely on theory and guesswork, it wouldn't help him much. So he decided to watch a little longer and maybe he would get a great chance. The hero left his shelter and visited the laboratory again, after checking that no one was there. Holding the candy bar in his paw, he approached the flask in which the amoeba had been located all this time. She noticed him immediately and was very happy. Edgar climbed onto the apparatus and, holding out one of the bars, said that this time he had brought food. The amoeba understood him and was very happy, after which he broke off several pieces and threw them into the right hole in the apparatus. They were immediately transmitted to the amoeba through the tubes, and it happily absorbed them. When there was nothing left, she shouted out that it was very tasty and thanked Edgar. There was something about her that interested him, even though she didn't have any special abilities. He suddenly remembered that Alexa almost always walked with her cat. This prompted Edgar to think that she was very attached to her pet, and if this cat died, then perhaps he would have a chance. This prey seemed to him the easiest, because no one guards him at all, and except for those cases when his mistress calls him, he is completely alone. Our hero timed it exactly right when the cat was left alone. He watched the animal closely from the ventilation pipe. The animal did not feel the stranger's presence at all, and continued to bask on its owner's soft bed. Edgar used his hypersensitivity again, thinking that killing the cat would probably be easy since he looked stupid enough, but it was definitely not the place to do it. Although everything looks normal at the entrance to the ventilation, if you look at it with hypersensitivity, you can see that the grill is covered with laser beams, and if you even slightly touch it, the alarm will immediately go off. Edgar thumped his tail on the floor in irritation, wondering how he could get around this trap. Caesar reacted to this barely perceptible sound. Jumping out of bed, he found himself in one leap near the bars, snorting loudly, which greatly frightened our hero. He leaned on the grate with his front paws, trying to knock it over. Armed soldiers immediately entered the room at the noise to understand what was going on. Looking around, they saw no one except Caesar, who was scratching at the ventilation system grate with his claws. One of the soldiers sighed in disappointment, clutching his head. He was already pretty tired of losing his temper every time because of this cat's latest prank. When they finally pulled the cat away from there, our hero rolled over on his back, trembling with terror. He couldn't believe that he could really screw up so badly. His eyes widened in surprise as a brilliant idea came to his mind. Edgar realized that this cat was bored of being in the room all the time, and this could be used. Thanks to his excellent hearing and sense of smell, it won't be difficult to attract his attention. Our hero also noticed the soldier's reaction to the cat. A wonderful plan naturally formed in his head. Several hours later, Caesar was still alone, curled up in a ball on his bed, asleep. Suddenly, something caught his attention, causing his amber eyes to open. Some noise came from behind the bars again. This time, Caesar acted more cautiously, approaching. He dropped down on his front paws and began to carefully peer inside, trying to understand what was there. Poisoned by Edgar's poison, the cockroach trembled slightly, unable to move. The cat gently pressed one paw on the grate. She gave in to him surprisingly easily and fell to the ground with a crash. Curiosity piqued Caesar and he jumped inside. These sounds were clearly heard by the soldiers standing on the other side of the entrance. They decided not to react to this and simply went to another place. Meanwhile, the cat moved further and further along the ventilation passage, finding more and more dead cockroaches along the way. The more he met them, the more interesting they became to him. At some point, he noticed a bright light ahead that caught his attention. Caesar no longer paid attention to the cockroaches, but immediately ran out there and stopped in amazement. He found himself at the entrance to an unusually spacious room, completely filled with various boxes and containers that seemed unusually interesting to him. Looking down, he noticed another trembling cockroach on the green container below him. Edgar was just waiting for this moment, and hovering in the air, he immediately attacked his target. Caesar tried to pick up a cockroach with his paw, completely unaware of the danger hanging over him. The sharp tip of Edgar's tail dug into his skin, injecting its venom. Feeling a sharp pain, the animal screamed in pain. Losing his balance, Caesar fell down. Edgar immediately landed next to the immobilized cat, his mouth wide open. When he tore the animal's flesh, he could not help but laugh with delight, for it tasted the best of all that he had ever tasted. Alex walked quickly into the room, causing horror among her employees. Following behind her were two soldiers, holding their weapons at the ready to attack at any moment if a threat appeared. A man sitting in his chair behind the monitors watched all this. Alex stopped right in front of him, and they exchanged heavy, silent glances. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked when she would finally be allowed to see Caesar, to which George replied that she needed to be a little patient because the soldiers were already looking for him everywhere. Alex cut him off mid-sentence, not letting him finish, and slamming her palms on the surface of the table, shouted that 2 whole hours had already passed, and there were still no results. She was absolutely sure that something had happened to her pet, because he usually strictly adheres to his eating schedule, and she angrily reported this to the captain sitting opposite her. He sighed and clasped his hands together, saying that Alex should calm down. He explained to her that they were all on the ship now, and if her cat hadn't flown away on the rescue ship and escaped, then he must be somewhere on board and would definitely be found. But his words did not calm Alex down at all. On the contrary, they made her even more angry. Then he said in a more insistent tone that she should go back to her place, calm down and just wait. He himself did not understand why she was so furious about the loss of an ordinary cat. George gritted his teeth in displeasure, thinking that if he could, he would order her locked in solitary confinement right then and there. Leaning forward a little, Alex nervously asked what was happening with the guards who were supposed to be watching Caesar, to which she was told that they were all currently under arrest, and certain punitive measures would soon be taken. When she said she wanted him to execute them immediately, the ship's captain was horrified, and his face showed it. Alex was filled with anger, and she could barely find the strength to restrain herself. Without taking her eyes off George, she said that the captain's powers fully allowed him to command everything at once, so her request should not seem difficult to him. George was not going to give in to her emotions and replied that he was not going to do it because if he executed them, the other soldiers would be very outraged by this. Alex did not expect to hear such an answer at all. Getting as close to him as possible, she muttered through her teeth that it was the soldiers who were to blame for what happened, because they did not perform their duties as they should have. The employees, still standing to the side, listened to their boss's conversation with frozen shock and bewilderment on their faces. The soldiers felt strong irritation and hostility towards Alexa, and could barely restrain themselves from saying everything they thought about her. The captain could not counter her with anything in response, since he himself understood perfectly well that the reason for what had happened was the incompetence of his soldiers. Looking down, the man replied that he agreed with her and would use this opportunity to discipline all the other soldiers. Alexa looked at him in bewilderment, hoping to hear what she wanted so much. But this did not happen, and then she sighed heavily, realizing that if she continued, she would achieve nothing and would simply waste her time. Turning around, she said she would be back in 2 hours. But before heading towards the exit, Alexa looked at the captain one last time and said with a threat in her voice that if there were still no results by the time she returned, then it would be better for George to leave his position as captain. Immediately after that, she strode out into the corridor, accompanied by soldiers, leaving the man confused. As soon as her back disappeared behind the door, George hit the table with all his might, cursing loudly. He had absolutely no idea where to look for this cat, which had become a serious threat to his wonderful life. Our hero observed all this from above through the ventilation grill. He couldn't help but smirk inside, because that cat had been cooking in his stomach for a long time. At that moment, a blue system window appeared in front of him, highlighting his newly acquired skill, Wild Instinct. He knew that this game had a thing called a skill fusion system that combined skills into one and strengthened them. He had used it often enough in the past that he had memorized almost all the combinations in the game. That's why when he was eating Caesar, he was speechless when he first saw the text box asking him to activate this skill, because he had never seen anything like it before. He pressed the consent button and immediately learned that he could combine the skills Wild Instinct and Super Sensitivity, which he did, and as a result, received a completely new skill, Predator's Sense, which allows him to detect a threat in advance. Edgar tried to use this skill because he was interested in testing its effectiveness. His expectations for his new ability did not fail him, because the super-sensitive ability became many times stronger than before. But no matter how much he tried, he was unable to awaken the future prediction that was also included in the Wild Instinct skill. Moving along the ventilation pipe, he decided that it was most likely a passive option that would turn on automatically if a threat appeared. Now he was interested in something else, namely Alexa, who was completely out of her mind, and this meant a great opportunity to get closer to her. Meanwhile, she reached the laboratory, where she gave vent to her anger. Besides the fact that her beloved pet was missing, she had another problem. The stabilization of the drugs was taking too long, and their experiments were still not moving forward. Edgar caught her just at the moment when she was lamenting about this. He had not been wrong earlier in his judgment that Alexa was the type of person who was very sensitive to what was dear to them, but if they were deprived of it, their world would immediately collapse. Our hero smiled contentedly. After all, he was able to achieve his second goal in one go, namely, separating Alexa and the soldiers, creating a great discord between them. He had noticed long ago that the soldiers didn't like Caesar from the start. It all started with the fact that they had to give up the best meat, which they couldn't even eat as food for an ordinary cat 3 times a day. Therefore, their dislike for the cat was quite normal on the part of the guards. If you dig a little deeper, you can see that the anger was initially about class, because Alexa belonged to the upper class in the mega corporation, and the soldiers had to obey her without question, fearing the consequences of directly protesting against her. They eventually chose her cat as a scapegoat to vent their anger on, so it's not hard to guess what will happen if the scapegoat disappears. The soldiers will no longer be able to protect Alexa as well as before. But that's not all. Alexa herself lost trust in her soldiers, and the only joy in her life due to the fault of those same soldiers. Edgar mentally thanked Caesar for helping him kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Afterwards, he decided that it was time for him to appropriate Alexa's genetic data. The girl suddenly raised her head, noticing something. She practically ran up to one of the devices where the experiment was currently being conducted. She quickly pressed a few buttons on the control panel without taking her eyes off the test subject. Everything was going completely differently than she wanted, and it was safe to say that this was yet another failure of hers. Cursing, she walked away from him and headed to a completely different end of the lab. Remembering something, she stopped and looked at her other experiment. Afterwards, she resolutely approached the amoeba. Alexa looked at the body, trembling with fear for several long seconds. Suddenly, a sinister smile blossomed on her lips. The next moment, she pressed one of the green buttons, starting another experiment. A high concentration of the drug was again injected into the amoeba. At the same time, powerful shocks of electricity began to pierce her body, and she screamed in pain and called for help. A few minutes later, Alex stopped the experiment. She was disappointed that here, too, failure awaited her. Without saying a word, she left the room. Edgar, watching everything that was happening here, was almost shaking from the rage that was overwhelming him. Suddenly, noticing him, the amoeba called out to him joyfully. Still shaking in pain, she waved at him. But Edgar could not answer her. After looking at her for a few more moments, he turned around and crawled away. Our hero understood perfectly well that now a few words of comfort would not help her, so instead, he decided to give Ray, as he began to call her to himself, what she really needed: revenge. After the agreed time had passed, Alexa returned to the captain's office and asked if there was any news, to which she was told that the soldiers were now going to search and asked to wait for her a little longer. She didn't like what she heard at all. Tilting her head to the side, she asked George with a menacing voice if he had really decided to challenge the will of the mega corporation NS. From the drops of cold sweat running down the man's face, it was obvious that he was nervous. Adding severity to his voice, he reminded Alexa that he was the captain of this ship, so she should watch her words carefully. In response to this, she shouted out that she would be happy to help him leave this post. But George only shook his head from side to side, reminding that even in the NS, abuse of power was unacceptable. So he had every right to detain her, the head of the research group, which caused great bewilderment in Alexa. The employees standing to the side glanced at her with displeasure, already quite tired of her endless complaints and nagging about everything. Edward was also present here, watching everything from above without giving away his presence. He was glad that everything was working out quite well, because apparently there had already been a conflict between the two long before his intervention. Alexa had no way to put pressure on George in response, so she clicked her tongue in displeasure and turned towards the exit, not at all flattered by the idea of being taken into custody. Filled with rage, she walked back to her room, trying to think of what she could possibly do in this situation. Suddenly, she stopped near the women's toilet. Without turning around, Alexa told the guards that she would step away for a moment and headed inside. The toilet doors slammed shut right under the guards' noses. Suddenly, one of them told his partner that he would also step away for a couple of minutes. Edgar overheard this and was delighted, because this was just the perfect opportunity for him. He tried to get to the women's toilet as quickly as possible through the ventilation pipe. He was simply incredibly lucky, because now his target was completely alone and very vulnerable. Moreover, there was no security system that would prevent him from passing. In the shortest possible time, he reached the required ventilation hole. He hid by the bars, checking to see if Alexa had left yet. Luckily for him, the girl was still there, her palms resting on the sink, looking down without raising her head. Edgar unscrewed the screws and got rid of the grate as quietly as possible. Alexa was too lost in her thoughts the whole time, washing her face with cool water, that she didn't remember anything at all. This was only to the hero's advantage. Occasionally glancing in the mirror at his victim, he crawled towards the ceiling. Once on the ceiling, he stopped and began collecting poison on the end of his pointed tail. Once everything was ready, Edgar continued on his way. At that very moment, Alexa finished washing her face and removed her palms from her face. Looking at herself in the mirror, she sighed wearily, thinking that today's incident had completely thrown her off track. Suddenly, her eyes widened in horror, and as if she had been doused with cold water, Alexa felt the approaching aura of death. She turned around immediately. Edgar was flying towards her at a terrifying speed, his poisonous sting extended forward. Seeing this, Alexa became even more frightened and, screaming in horror, stepped back. Because of this, our hero's sharp sting flew past her cheek without touching her. Edgar flew into the mirror. But he wasn't going to give up so easily, so without a second's hesitation, he attacked Alexa again. This time, she didn't have time to react quickly enough, and piercing her neck with his sting, the hero injected poison, which began to spread quite quickly throughout her body. Alexa screamed in sharp, throbbing pain. A few moments later, the veins on her body bulged dangerously, and white foam began to come out of her mouth. Unable to bear it any longer, Alexa fell to her knees. The next moment, she collapsed limply onto the cold floor. Her face twisted in horror and fear as she raised her head to see who had attacked her and whose drool was now dripping onto the floor right next to her head. Edgar's eyes turned red as he slowly approached his victim, driven by the desire to devour her whole. Opening his mouth, he saw Alexa's reaction to this and he liked it. The hero was interested in what she was thinking about at that moment, whether she was angry at what was happening, afraid of death, or both at once. But the answers to these questions will remain unanswered for him, because a moment later, his mouth closed on the girl's face, absorbing her scream of horror. The moment he absorbed her peace, Edgar felt the blood containing Alexa's genetic information being absorbed through his stomach into his blood vessels, then reaching his brain. Then our hero realized that one of the guesses contained in his subconscious turned out to be correct. The long-awaited system window appeared in front of him with a message that all the conditions for evolution had been met, and now he was offered to evolve. He raised his bloody paw to press the consent button. But he didn't have time to do this, because at that very moment, a bright flash of endless images of one of the armed soldiers bursting into the toilet poured into his head. He immediately grabbed his machine gun and aimed it at Edgar. Before he could do anything, his entire body was pierced by numerous bullets, turning his body into a bloody mess. Thus, Edgar's life ended. The images he saw greatly frightened our hero, and his body began to tremble slightly with horror. He was completely disoriented and did not understand what had just happened. Touching his paw to the head, Edgar suggested that perhaps this was Predator's sense. The hero glanced sideways towards the doors, deciding that if what he saw was his imminent future, then he should hide as quickly as possible. Driven by such thoughts, he got off Alexa's dead body and crawled towards the walls. As he crawled upward, he left behind a bright trail of blood. At that very moment, the door opened and a soldier entered the room. Coming out from around the corner, he immediately stopped, frozen in shock. The man refused to believe his eyes. He couldn't bring himself to take a single step. The sight of his boss's mangled body filled him with wild horror. Daniel had absolutely no idea what had happened here, and who could have treated Alexa like that. Even though he didn't consider her the best person, it was simply inhumane. The man, completely immersed in his thoughts, did not notice how Edward snuck up on him from behind. It was only when he felt a strange weight on his shoulder that Daniel looked at him in bewilderment. The hero took advantage of this and raised his sting for another attack. It was no trouble for him to pierce the soldier's helmet and his skin. A moment later, the man fell to the floor dead, and Edward jumped aside. The walls and floor of the room were covered in red stains of blood from the two murdered men. Having accomplished his goal, our hero hurried to leave this place before someone else came here. After looking around the room again, he picked up the grate and decided that he should make a couple of laps around the ship before heading to the nest. Edgar was wary of the possibility that there might be some kind of surveillance equipment that he might not be aware of. So an hour later, he returned to his lair and immediately activated his super sensitivity. After checking that there was no threat nearby, he looked around again to make sure. Afterwards, he called up the system window and clicked on the Evolve button. His paws immediately began to become covered in some strange slime. Edgar was overcome with a wave of fear and bewilderment as the slime covered his entire body, pinning him to the ground. A few moments later, he was completely unable to move, and of the parts of his body that were not covered with mucus, only one of his eyes remained. But this did not last long. As soon as his whole body was covered with mucus, it immediately thickened on the outside. Thus, our hero found himself enclosed in a kind of cocoon. The fear quickly went away and was replaced by relaxation and calm. Edgar felt that the slime enveloping him was grinding something completely different out of him, and he had an unbearable desire to open his eyes and see how it was happening, but he could not. Our hero completely lost the ability to control his body, which was now undergoing significant changes, so all he could do was wait for it all to end. Thus, a whole day passed, during which significant changes also occurred with the cocoon. Suddenly, several green pieces of frozen liquid, which covered our hero's entire lair, fell onto the cocoon with a dull thud. It immediately began to open up from the inside. A moment later, several clawed dark paws appeared. Following this, Edgar himself began to emerge from the cocoon, covered in a transparent sticky liquid. His new evolved body was significantly larger than his old one. Our hero's eyes reflected surprise when he looked at his paw, which had 4 fingers instead of claws. A loud roar escaped his mouth, echoing off the walls of his shelter. Meanwhile, George called an emergency meeting to ask if the head of the medical team had been able to determine the cause of the soldier's death. He looked up from his papers and replied that if you looked with the naked eye, you could easily determine that the cause of the soldier's death was a blow to the throat, which was most likely made with a small saw. When everyone gathered, heard that they would only be able to get a more detailed answer after a detailed inspection had been carried out, they immediately became tense. They did not like the fact that they were completely in the dark about the current situation. Nicholas was silent for a few moments, giving everyone a chance to think about what they had heard. Suddenly, he rose from his seat and, looking uncertainly at the captain, said that he would most likely have to perform an autopsy. The head of the medical team winced in horror as George swore loudly. Then he dropped his head into his hands and sighed wearily. After sitting like that for a couple of seconds, he looked up at the man sitting to his left, who was the head of the security system, and asked how things were going with the search. He also stood up and replied that all the videos from the cameras on board had been thoroughly checked, but nothing special could be found. So now the main suspect was being interrogated, the security guard who was supposed to accompany Alex along with his murdered partner. The captain asked if Pavel really thought that the guard was a criminal. He shook his head uncertainly and replied that based on the information they had today, the likelihood of this would be too small. After listening to him, George said that he should be informed immediately as soon as any results appeared. Then he turned his tired gaze in another direction. It was mentally difficult for him to look at the empty seat at the table that Alexa used to occupy. He sighed and said that everyone present should already know about what had recently happened in the lab, causing his subordinates to shudder in horror. George ignored their reaction and continued by saying that one of their most promising employees was trapped in a capsule by the head of the research team. They managed to extract the brain and place it in the lab. At the end, he added emphatically that this awaits everyone who disobeyed, and asked what punishment would await those who not only disobeyed, but were involved in the death of a member of the National Assembly. The heads of all departments gritted their teeth when they heard the captain's words that if they did not want to be tortured with electric current, leaving only the brain, then they should immediately take all necessary measures to avoid this fate. Each of them understood that this was not just a threat to intimidate them, and that one day it could turn into their reality. After clearing his throat, Michael suggested reporting that there had simply been an accident during the experiment. Nicholas interrupted him rudely, folding his arms across his chest and saying with displeasure that the head of the navigation group should think more carefully about his thoughts before suggesting something like that, since it would not be so easy for them to explain why one of the leading researchers had died. Jacob immediately intervened in the conversation, adjusting his glasses and putting forward his idea for discussion. But when his proposal was ignored by everyone because his colleagues were focused only on themselves and trying to defend their point of view, without any desire to hear anything else, then his patience also came to an end. A serious feud has broken out between the heads of all departments, threatening to escalate into a fight. Suddenly, someone loudly banged their fist on the table surface and loudly ordered everyone to calm down. Jumping up from his seat, Richard said that their arguments were only making the situation worse. Everyone froze in their places, not taking their eyes off Richard and thinking about what he had said. Meanwhile, he turned his gaze to the captain and, turning to him, reported that they were now near planet number 08. He nodded weakly and asked if there were any problems with this. When Richard replied that planet 08 was a space dog zone, George visibly frowned. The man glared at Richard, standing in front of him, and asked if he was thinking about making it look like the puppies were the ones causing the trouble. And Richard nodded confidently and said that they should pretend they were attacked. George was in no hurry to give any definite answer to this proposal, thinking everything over carefully. Everyone knew that space dogs were one of the main enemies of the mega corporation, as they roamed space and robbed. In addition, they have quite a lot of experience in interfleet battles, and ships under the command of veterans often receive significant damage. Therefore, the research ship may well become their next target, and then the damage they cause can hardly be called repairable. George couldn't help but note that if they did report the attack, the death of the research team leader could be hushed up without any further investigation. After thinking it over, he looked at Richard and said that this proposal would be ideal, if not for one significant, but with their current weapons, they are completely powerless against the space dogs. In response to this remark, Richard said that he had connections with old acquaintances, and there was no need to worry about this, which caused shock among his colleagues. Richard sighed heavily once again, massaging his temples. This guy had never ceased to amaze him since the very first day they met. Without opening his eyes, the captain asked how much money he would need. When he heard the announced price of 1,000,000 credits, he clenched his teeth in displeasure, cursing under his breath. This was an unacceptably large amount. Meanwhile, Richard continued, explaining that Alex would be too much for even the space dogs to handle, so the risk on their part was justified by the price range. George had no choice but to agree to this adventure. Nodding, he told Richard that he should complete it in the shortest possible time. He nodded in agreement and thanked the captain for his trust. After this, George rose from his seat and announced that their meeting was over. At the same moment, Nicholas jumped up from his seat and, raising his hand, asked what they should do with the body. The captain replied that it should be preserved for now, and then they would hand it over to the pirates, and ordered that no one be allowed near the body until that moment. Our hero was still in his shelter and trying to get used to his new body. He liked the way he had changed, because all his senses had become much sharper, and his body felt stronger. He had finally become a full-fledged individual. Moving from his spot, Edgar decided that he should reconsider his plan of further action. Previously, he was forced to constantly hide in the darkness in order to survive. But now for him, hunting and survival have become identical concepts. By calling the system window, he decided to determine his further goal. The blue window that appeared said that the previous goal, evolution, was successfully completed, and now he needs to learn to survive. He also noted changes in his abilities. He had 2 new skills: enhanced exoskeleton and acidic blood. Eric considered the mark of successful evolution as an indicator that he had become an individual. He knew that Amorph had a 6-stage branch of evolution, 5 of which were spent on transformation. The first is a cub, which is what he was until this day. Then comes the individual. It was at this stage that our hero was now. After this, Amorph turns into a teenage individual. From there, he turns into a young individual. And finally comes the last stage of transformation, the adult. Once all of these are completed, Amorph will be able to transform into an ascended individual, which is considered his final and strongest form. Upon reaching it, the game revealed the secret of the origin of the Amorpha race. Our hero hoped that something like this would be revealed to him if he reached the final form. Edward understood that in order for him to achieve a full-fledged form of any race, he would need to put in a lot of effort. While studying the information in the system window, he noticed something. Now, a new characteristic became available to him, a type that was currently undefined for him. When he clicked on the type field, a new window appeared in front of him, in which he was offered to review the list of proposed types. After thinking for a moment, Edward pressed the Yes button. Immediately after this, 2 types appeared in front of him available for selection: strengthening physical strength, which was pumped up by 6 units out of 10, and strengthening superpowers, which was pumped up by 1.5 units out of 3 possible, which greatly surprised our hero. He knew that the type in this game was similar to a race's specialization, but had a slightly different purpose and was only activated when specific conditions were met. Thinking about the type of superpower enhancement, he realized that he had been given 1 point for his predatory instinct, which he had received by absorbing the genetic data of cockroaches and Caesar. But he didn't understand where the extra 10th came from, because he didn't have any other skills that fit that type. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise as he realized what was happening. He remembered that he had eaten Alexa's flesh, which he guessed must have had extrasensory abilities. This realization pushed him to want to obtain her power completely, and to do this he needed to find her corpse, which is what he was going to do. Edgar reached the vent in seconds and removed the grate, which he had left only for show. Having climbed inside, our hero immediately realized the first disadvantage of his large body. These narrow passages became terribly inconvenient for him to move around. Suddenly, as he moved towards his goal, he felt the incredibly intense smell of a corpse. Edgar immediately sped up and followed the smell to determine its source. He didn't have to search for long, just a couple of turns and he was already frozen above the next grate, looking inside the room. The smell of bodies from the morgue seemed irresistibly sweet to him. The hero simply could not believe his luck that his target could be found so quickly and easily. All that was left to do was to carefully enter the room, trying not to attract attention. Luckily for him, there was only 1 living person in the morgue, and the container with Alexa's body was right behind him. He was completely immersed in his work on the computer and paid practically no attention to anything. Suddenly, the room was filled with a strange, unpleasant smell, which Adam immediately noticed. Taking off his headphones, he put them aside and walked outside, covering his nose with his hand to determine where the smell was coming from. However, as soon as he left the morgue, the guy froze in place from shock. There was a hole in the floor, eaten away by acid. Edgar took advantage of his confusion and slipped behind him unnoticed. Meanwhile, Adam was barely holding back his panic, trying to understand where such a caustic acid could have come from. Deciding that he needed to call security immediately, he turned back towards the entrance to the morgue. At that very moment, our hero rushed at him. His pointed tail literally pierced the guy's head in a second, and he didn't even have time to understand what happened. Adam's body, covered in his own blood, was thrown aside onto the cold floor. Edgar was now free to reach his goal, and entering inside, he pulled Alexa's body out of the refrigerated box. With 4 fingers of his paw, he grabbed the sheet that hid the girl's body and pulled it off with one sharp movement. The hero immediately had a view of his victim's body. He looked at her with a searching gaze, noticing that she had not changed one bit even after death. His paw landed on Alexa's face, and with the help of his current body, it was easy for him to separate her head from her body. Afterwards, he brought her severed head closer to himself. It seemed strange to him that, having already killed several people, he did not feel any guilt. Without taking his eyes off Alexa, he speculated that he might have changed due to his new surroundings, or that the ruthless killer monster he had become was his true self. Throwing these thoughts aside, he opened his mouth over the girl's head. Having instantly absorbed her, Edgar switched to her body. In order to survive, he had to kill. Such was the life of Amorph, and he had to adapt to it. As he devoured her body, piece by piece, he thought about how Agnia's body would simply rot after death and become a nutrient medium for nature. So if she instead became a nutrient for him, it wouldn't be much different. Suddenly, he felt something crunch between his teeth. Opening his mouth, he pulled out some strange object on his tongue. Taking it in his hand, he examined it more closely, completely not understanding what it was and why this thing was in Alexa's heart. Edward thought that she might just have heart problems and clenched his fist, breaking this now unnecessary junk. Suddenly, a familiar system window appeared in front of him, and after reading the information from it, our hero confirmed his assumption that Alexa possessed psychedelic powers. It said that the acquisition of genetic data was successful, and now our hero had access to the ability extrasensory perception, which did not make him very happy, because Amorph was able to use such an ability without having superpowers. He pressed the button to activate this ability because he would have to accept it anyway if he wanted to get the type. As soon as Edgar did this, several growths immediately appeared on his head, which significantly sensed his perception. He touched his new body part hesitantly. Afterwards, the hero approached the body of the murdered Adam and ran his hand over the sensor, thinking that the predator's sense skill always activates very suddenly, and, to his delight, it can become useful in combination with other skills. The remains of Alexa's body began to slowly return back to the refrigeration compartment, and Edgar decided to have a last snack of security, since he had already accomplished his main goal here. It was precisely during the process of his snack that he sensed danger. The hero realized that the changing of the guard was about to take place and immediately activated his ability of hypersensitivity. He was confused by the soldiers passing their equipment to others and thought that there weren't that many people on the ship wearing reinforced protective suits. Looking at Adam's body, Edward wondered if the doctor would be replaced too, because if a replacement came here, he would notice blood and corpses, and since they are all on the ship, it is not difficult to assume that people will immediately understand that the enemy is also here. Edward tried to think of what to do, as he was not yet strong enough to start an all-consuming war with the ship's members, so instead, he needed to somehow buy time. Suddenly, an idea came to his mind. He glanced sideways at the floor eaten away by his acid. The hero realized that with the help of the trick he had come up with, he would not only be able to stall for time, but also intimidate the ship's crew, which would be very effective, especially when they were going through a crisis. The mega corporation had no official capital, but there was one place that could well be called its center. Earth was the headquarters, and also the center of the current corporation. The 5 companies that contributed to the creation of the mega corporation were called the Kings of Earth. The Yu family, of which the murdered Alexa was a part, belonged to one of these 5 families, its roots originating in what was formerly known as East Asia. At that time, this family started with a small business in the Republic of Korea, and now all the land in this country was the residence of the Yu family. It houses small aircraft and magnetic strip trains for travel, and an artificial sun for the internal ecosystem. And the inhabitants of the country were only people belonging to the Yu family, and people playing the role of instruments subordinate to this family. On one of the separate islands among a small forest and spacious fields, there was a small, neat house with a lake adjacent to it. There was only one person living here, Dominic, who worked the soil with a joyful smile on his face. He enjoyed this activity, so he tended his field with full dedication every day. Suddenly, Two men dressed in dark suits appeared a few meters away from him. Noticing their presence, Dominic looked up from his work and slowly rose to his feet, after which he looked at the men and said that they could come. They looked at each other, after which one of them stepped forward. When Dominic asked what was wrong with a friendly smile on his face, Paul replied that he had news regarding Miss Alexa. Simon, who remained on the sidelines, listened attentively to this conversation. He visibly tensed up. He was afraid to even guess the consequences of this meeting. Still smiling broadly, Dominic asked what had happened to his third daughter, since they had come straight here. Paul clasped his hands behind his back and replied that Alexa's signal device had been destroyed. Dominic didn't believe him and said that it was simply impossible, because he didn't force her to do something so burdensome. Then Paul told that the last time the signal came from Planet 08, which is the territory of space dogs, the man looked thoughtful, listening to Paul. As soon as he finished speaking, Dominic put his hand on the guy's shoulder. The next moment, his fist hit Paul in the face. The white shirt was immediately stained with red splashes, and Paul himself flew back a few meters and fell to the ground. He tried to get up, but the blow was too strong and he couldn't do it. Meanwhile, Dominic slowly approached him. Still smiling, he sat on the guy and began to deliver blow after blow with the hoe all over his body. Several long minutes later, Dominic finished and threw the bloody hoe aside. Rising to his feet, he ordered his men to get rid of the body, and they immediately rushed to carry out this order. He folded his hands behind his back and, looking into the distance, said that he did not need a tool to look for answers to unasked questions. One of the men, dressed in the same black suit as the murdered Paul, bowed low and, trying to hide his horror, replied that they would be more careful. Dominic then went on to say that he had to spend 1 billion credits raising Alexa, which was equivalent to spending the same amount of money to develop a new battleship. Wiping the blood from his face, he said that he would like to know who dared to harm the favorite of the Yu family. Thinking about this, he called Simon to him and asked if the captain of the ship Alexa was on was George Silos. When his assumption was confirmed, Dominic thoughtfully said that since the Silos family was involved, whose satellite was Titan, then the matter was taking quite interesting turns. The doubt on his face quickly changed to his previous carefree expression. Dominic was sure that the head of this family simply did not have the courage to sink his teeth into the Yu family. Turning around, he asked his butler what he thought about this, who bowed and replied that most likely the Troes family could have interfered in this matter. Dominic's eyes were filled with amusement, and he said that Constantine was thinking about the same thing he was thinking about. They were aware that the heads of the Troes and Silos families were actively fighting for control of Jupiter, but in fact they were in secret collusion with each other. It wasn't difficult to expose their alliance. It was enough to just find out that the loans of the head of Silos came from Troes. Dominic suddenly asked if his butler knew that Troes was ready to take the initiative on the board of directors. He replied that Aaron, the head of Troes, was currently holding the position of CEO. Dominic nodded and, placing his palms on his hips, said that this fool was decisively against him. After these words, a loud laugh escaped the man's lips. But a moment later, there was no trace of the smile left on his face. His tone became much more serious, and he said that this time they had a reason, so they would strike first, and told Constantine to tell the family everything and then deal with the matter of the 8th planet. He bowed obediently. Constantine understood perfectly well that there were few peaceful days left, and very soon rivers of blood would be spilled. Dominic did not stop there and angrily shouted that all those who had any connection with the ship should be brought to him. He had no intention of forgiving those who dared to destroy his assets. Meanwhile, on the ship, everyone was already aware of the disaster that had occurred in the morgue. George was beside himself with barely contained rage. The bodies of all the guards were burned alive, and all the doctors are now trying to understand how this happened. A little later, 2 soldiers approached him and reported that a strange gas had been discovered in the room. This information made George wary, because when they entered, all the facts pointed to a fire. Immediately after this, the soldiers stepped aside, leaving the ship's captain alone with his thoughts. Nicholas examined the scene and the bodies very carefully, but could not understand how a fire could have started in the morgue. Suddenly he noticed a ring on the body, with the help of which the man determined that it was a member of the team working overtime. This clue gave him some ideas. Turning to his colleague, Nicholas asked if these were all the bodies, to which he was told that no one else had been found. Horror was reflected on his face, and he barely audibly said that this simply could not be. But George heard, and, leaning forward a little, excitedly asked what had happened. The head of the medical team, his face noticeably pale, looked at the captain and said that they needed to immediately call all the ship's leaders together because they had serious problems. 20 minutes later, an emergency meeting was called. where Nicholas informed everyone that the bodies of the guard and the head of the research team were missing. This news shocked George so much that he jumped up from his seat and asked in bewilderment how this could have happened, since the corpses couldn't just leave on their own. An equally shocked and confused Nicholas said he had checked several times, but 2 bodies were still missing. Then he turned his gaze to Richard and said uncertainly that if we were talking about the chemicals stored in the morgue, they could of course ignite, but a fire of this scale was practically impossible. When Nicholas paused before continuing, Richard, who had grasped the gist of what was happening, finished for him, telling everyone that the fire was man-made. Upon hearing this, everyone immediately began to whisper about who it could be. But Pavel suggested that there might be unidentified alien beings on board their ship. Bill, who was sitting next to him, turned to him and shouted that Pavel should not have spoken such nonsense so thoughtlessly. In response, Pavel said with displeasure that he had merely assumed and that the head of logistics should not be so nervous about this. Nicholas intervened in their conversation, saying that the more serious problem in the current situation was that Alexa's body had disappeared. As soon as he reminded him of this, George's face changed. Jumping up from his seat, the captain loudly slammed his palms on the table and said that they needed to find her body at any cost. Pavel raised his hand and suggested that they first look for the criminal. His proposal completely infuriated the captain. No longer holding back his emotions, he angrily shouted that this issue concerned not only him, and if they were afraid of revenge from the representatives of the NS, then they should all start cooperating already. Otherwise, the same unenviable fate awaited everyone. After his remark, a tense silence fell in the room, which no one present dared to break. Having caught his breath and calmed down a little, George turned to Richard and asked if he had already contacted the pirates. He nodded and replied that he had done so immediately after their last meeting. Hearing this, the captain swore quietly and, clutching his head, ordered Richard not to tell the pirates anything about what had happened for now, and simply informed them that they would hand over the body. When the head of the crisis management department asked if everything would be okay, George replied that it was his idea in the first place, and if they didn't find a way out, there would be another problem. So they needed to find the body as soon as possible. Richard just nodded in agreement without saying anything. The captain walked around the table and stopped next to Pavel, put his hand on his shoulder and asked with pressure if he understood everything. He glanced at him sideways and replied that he would do everything possible. George was not satisfied with his answer and, leaning closer, shouted that Pavel could even interrogate all the crew members, but he would find the criminal at any cost. Our hero watched all this from the ventilation pipe, listening attentively to their conversations. He was incredibly happy that his brilliant plan had worked like a charm. The simplest idea to hide his existence and intimidate his enemies was to start a fire. And having found many dangerous substances in it, Edgar poured everything on the floor. At the very end, he added a couple of drops of his acidic blood. In this way, he successfully created a fire that successfully hid the traces of his existence. But he never expected that the conversation would turn to alien beings, and he immediately decided to write off the captain of this ship as crazy, because few people in their right minds would decide to get involved with that space debris. As everyone began to disperse, Edgar kept his eyes on Richard's back, whom he was going to check a little later, because he suspected him of conspiring with the pirates. He was well aware that pirates were representatives of different races, and he could obtain a lot of gene essences, which was certainly good, but an assault could significantly reduce the number of genes that he could obtain on this research ship. Suddenly, something else caught our hero's attention. Looking down, he saw that the very last person to leave the conference room was the gloomy head of the logistics department, who denied the existence of alien beings. Edgar remembered him because he wondered why the man said that if he had nothing to do with the situation. Suddenly, Bill stopped at one of the doors and looked around with noticeable excitement. Afterwards, having made sure that there was no one else there, he touched the fingerprint scanner installed on the door. The door to the cargo bay immediately opened, letting Bill inside. Although Edgar understood that since this man was the head of the logistics department, and therefore visiting the cargo bay was a normal thing for him, his wariness looked too suspicious. Our hero was curious about what Bill had hidden there to make him so excited, so he followed him and made his way into the cargo bay through the ventilation passages. He carefully examined the room with the help of his hypersensitivity and found one strange container, near which the trace of the head of the department ended. The hero also noted that in addition to a fingerprint scanner, this container also had an ID card entry system, which meant that this container had increased security compared to all the others. In addition to this, the walls of this container were so thick that Edgar could not find out what was going on inside, even with the help of his abilities, and this greatly alarmed him. Initially, our hero planned to get rid of the head of the medical department, but changed his mind, and now his next target was Bill. A little later, Bill moved to another place where he desperately tried to get drunk. His subordinate, sitting next to him at the bar, tried to reason with his boss, but he didn't listen to him at all, and from time to time asked the bartender to repeat the order, filling the glass with a new portion of throat-scalding strong alcohol. As he drained his glass, Bill thought sadly about how what was happening to him lately could hardly be called life. He regretted trusting that strange black market merchant who handed him the strange eggs and told him they were found in ancient ruins. Then he naively decided that he could make some good money from this and brought it to the ship in secret from everyone. Everything was fine until one day, when he decided to have a drink, one of the eggs hatched. Absorbed in these thoughts, he slowly headed back to himself, when suddenly he heard strange sounds somewhere behind him, which seriously scared him. The man immediately turned around and with poorly concealed fear in his voice asked who was there. But no one answered him because there was no one else there except him. This calmed Bill down a little, and he decided to attribute it to stress. Afterwards, he turned around and continued on his way, grumbling something discontentedly under his breath. However, as soon as he took a couple of steps, an all-consuming horror enveloped his body. He slowly turned around and looked back again, trying to figure out if there really was someone else here, or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Bill was really hoping for the second option, but when he noticed someone's massive body rushing a couple of meters away from him, he simply froze in horror. All his worst fears were confirmed. Panic and animal fear were reflected in his eyes. Having come to his senses, he started to run, trying to save his life from an unknown enemy. Tears streamed from his eyes as he prayed only to reach the nearest safe place and hide there. Stopping at the door, he began to actively press the sensor, hoping that this would make the door open faster. A couple of seconds later, the door opened and Bill immediately ran inside without looking back. He continued running but suddenly tripped over a bottle of alcohol abandoned on the floor and fell with a crash. Noticing the phone, the man crawled towards it to call and warn the rest of the crew of the danger. A terrible screeching sound behind the door made him freeze in place in horror again. But when this grinding stopped quickly enough and Bill heard the approving beeping of the system, the shocked man glanced sideways towards the door, not losing hope until the very end that he had simply imagined this sound. Unfortunately for him, the next moment the door to the room opened. Edgar immediately entered inside. At the sight of him, Bill, trembling with fear, began to instinctively crawl back until he encountered an obstacle in the form of a wall. Edgar approached him quickly enough, and hanging over him, opened his mouth, revealing a row of sharp teeth. Bill could not utter a word. The fear of him completely consumed him. The hero mentally wished himself a bon appetit, and opening his mouth even wider, bit off the head of his sobbing victim. Having dealt with Bill, Edgar began to search his room, glad that thanks to the dissolute lifestyle of this man, killing him turned out to be easier than it seemed. Our hero examined every corner of the table, the drawers of which were filled to capacity with various junk that he didn't need. He himself believed that the captain of this ship should be grateful to him for reducing the number of people on the staff who were being paid salaries in vain, which were spent on drink. When the search dragged on for too long, Edward's good mood began to turn into irritation. After searching the entire room again, he still couldn't find Bill's ID card, and he had no other ideas where the card might be other than in this room. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a poster hanging on the wall with a posing beauty in a red bikini on the beach. Edward appreciated the girl's sexuality, but along with this came the realization that in his new body, he no longer experienced the same feelings when looking at such pictures. Then his gaze dropped to a bright yellow folder lying on the dresser, and as soon as he picked it up, a small map fell out. A joyful smile immediately appeared on Edgar's face when he realized that this was the very map he had been looking for all this time. And now that he had both the prints and the map, there was nothing more for him to do here. Glancing sideways at the remains of Bill's body, the hero decided that he should clean up after himself before leaving. He ate his remains, noting that the man tasted simply awful because he reeked of alcohol. Immediately after that, he left that room and moved to the cargo bay, where he easily found the very container that had interested him earlier. Stopping next to him, Edgar first of all inserted Bill's ID card into the appropriate slot. He then placed the man's bloody palm on the fingerprint sensor panel. After a couple of seconds, the container door slowly opened, releasing cold, stale air. Edgar walked inside and looked around with interest, studying what Bill had hidden here. Stopping at the cryo chambers, he looked at them in surprise, realizing that the man he had killed was a smuggler. Suddenly, something else caught his attention. Among the filled jars, he saw one open, amorphous egg. Edgar looked at him with a searching gaze for a few moments. Afterwards, he took the remains of the egg in his paw, surprised to realize that this is where it hatched from. This discovery greatly surprised our hero, and he thought that perhaps if he had not hatched here, Bill would have taken him to an unknown place, where the chances of survival would most likely be much lower. The starting location of Amorph in the game was not this ship at all, but mysterious ruins on one of the planets. Edgar looked behind the container and came to the conclusion that the previous owner of this body tried to leave this place immediately after birth, and judging by the remaining traces, died very soon due to lack of food, and then he was transferred to this body. Placing the egg on the floor, he finally understood the reason why the cockroaches had seemed so tasty to him in the first days. His body was moving instinctively, trying to survive. Then he himself bowed down before this egg to honor the memory of the true owner of its body. After the hero had finished with all the ceremonies, he decided that it was time for him to start doing what befits an Amorph. Returning to the egg crate, he broke open the jars and pulled out 2 still unhatched eggs. In one go, Edgar bit through these eggs with his sharp teeth and began to devour them. This was the nature of the true Amorph. The one who awakened first absorbs all the other eggs in order to survive and become stronger. It took him only a couple of minutes to absorb all of his relatives. Having finished with them, he turned his gaze to the cryo chambers, in which other living organisms were also imprisoned, immersed in deep sleep. A predatory grin appeared on his face at the thought that today he would have a delicious feast. Sometime later, he came out of there. Thanks to the system, he learned that he managed to get a few more new abilities, and now he only needed 2 points to get the strong body type. However, when he ate Alexa, he was disappointed because instead of an extrasensory ability, he got a useless extrasensory organ. But today, the head of the logistics department presented him with a very generous gift and helped him get strong characteristics that are usually obtained only by the middle of the game. With such thoughts, our hero left the cargo bay. As he crawled through the ventilation passages, Edgar noted that he now felt more confident because the new characteristics would help him eliminate the ship's crew members much more effectively. He felt that the encounter with the space dogs was just around the corner and therefore tried to increase his fighting power before the clash with them because he did not yet know how strong his opponent was. Thinking back to the crew members, Edgar smiled in anticipation of how many more horror-stricken faces he would be able to see. Meanwhile, on the runway of the research ship, work was gradually being completed, and everyone was in a hurry to leave this place in order to quickly go to rest. Nick had also finished his work, and stopping at the plane his friend was working on, he called out to him, informing him that almost everyone had already left and that they should also hurry if they didn't want to miss their dinner. He put his tools aside and sighed tiredly as he exited the plane, noticing the displeasure on his friend's face. Nick asked if there was much work left, to which Scott replied that he would have to stay a couple more nights to work overtime. Having left the landing bay, they quickly reached the canteen, where the rest of the workers were already having dinner. Even while eating, Scott couldn't stop thinking about work. He shared his thoughts with a friend about how the order for maintenance seemed too strange to him, because even if there was a fight, there was absolutely no point in reassembling the planes now. Nick asked Scott angrily if he really wanted to talk about this while eating, to which he replied that it was indeed very strange. He also shared with his friend a rumor that their superiors were preparing to hunt the metal gremlin. This news horrified Nick. He understood perfectly well that if they really clashed in battle, then there would be no trace left of them. When Scott told him that their enemy was already on board the ship, Nick was puzzled and asked why he thought that. To which his friend replied that there was some strange smell in the air throughout the ship, and that it was undoubtedly the smell of a metal gremlin. Nick sighed wearily and returned to his dinner, deciding not to pay much attention to Scott's fantasies, who was always too impressionable. However, when he said that people had started disappearing since last night, a man sitting next to him joined their conversation, saying that he had also heard something similar, and that the head of the logistics department had also disappeared somewhere, and in connection with this, a new manager of the cargo bay had been appointed. Nick looked up from his food again and looked at Philip seriously and asked why, if everything was really as they said, the management wasn't doing anything. Philip replied that the management was carefully trying to hide everything that was happening in order to avoid unnecessary excitement, while Scott nodded his head vigorously, repeating that the metal gremlin was to blame for everything. Nick was already tired of listening to the ravings of these two crazy people, and without finishing his dinner, he stood up from his seat and asked with irritation what relation these disappearances of people had to the maintenance of fighters. When Scott hesitantly suggested that perhaps this was his boss's way of trying to enforce discipline, Nick silently shot him a look full of displeasure. Afterwards, he headed towards the entrance, throwing out a parting word that they shouldn't get involved in this matter. In the darkness of the landing bay, the quiet sound of working instruments could be heard. Nick found his friend, who despite the late hour was still working on his plane. When he said he was going to get something to eat and asked if Scott should grab something too, Scott, without looking up from his work, replied that he didn't need anything, instead asking Nick to grab some synthetic alcohol with him. After listening to his friend's request, Nick nodded and headed towards the exit, leaving Scott alone. He didn't look up for a minute, trying to finish everything as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he heard Nick's voice asking him to come over for a couple of minutes. Scott was momentarily confused and replied that he was a little busy at the moment and wouldn't be able to come over. Then Nick repeated his request, saying that it wouldn't take long. The man really didn't want to take a break from work, so this request irritated him. As he pulled out from under the plane, he swore that if Nick had called him over some trifle, he would not be shown mercy later. He sat down on the floor and began to look around, trying to find his friend, who was calling him so actively. When Scott didn't find him, he was puzzled as to why he had been called and why he had gone off somewhere himself. Suddenly, Nick's excited voice came from behind the open door of the maintenance room, urging Scott on. He rose to his feet and, coming closer, looked inside uncertainly. Not daring to go inside, he asked in confusion what Nick was doing there, especially without light, to which he was told that he was looking for something and needed help. The man sighed heavily and stepped inside, taking his flashlight out of his pants pocket. He walked deeper into the room and, with the help of a flashlight, tried to figure out where his friend was. Suddenly, a strong, disgusting smell of rotten fish hit his nose. Scott immediately covered his nose and mouth with his hand to somehow protect himself from this stench. Continuing on his way, he called out to Nick, asking where he was. Suddenly, he felt like he had stepped on something. Because of this, he fell to the floor with a bang. He grunted in pain and rubbed his bruised forehead. It was only at this moment that the thought occurred to him that this situation was too suspicious. He glanced towards the flashlight lying nearby, thinking that even if he used it, it would still be practically impossible to see anything in such darkness, and his friend was going to go to the dining room, but not here. Thinking about the dining room, his memory flashed back to their dinner conversation about the missing people on board and the metal gremlin. Hearing quiet footsteps behind him, he called out to Nick, asking if it was him. In response, he heard only someone's quiet laughter, which filled Scott with wild horror. But before he could even do anything, a powerful paw grabbed his face. Smiling ominously, Edward said in Nick's voice that this was his end. From behind the walls of the maintenance room, Scott's heart-rending death screams could be heard as our hero devoured him alive, enjoying the suffering of his victim. 20 minutes later, Nick returned and called out to his friend, saying that he had brought alcohol. However, he did not find Scott in his place, only his tools set aside. Confused by this, he looked under the plane, knowing full well that his friend was not one to give up halfway through. Suddenly, Nick heard Scott's voice shouting that he was in the maintenance room. He stopped at the entrance to the adjoining room and asked in bewilderment what Scott needed there. His friend told him that he needed to find something here and that help wouldn't hurt. Nick clicked his tongue in displeasure and stepped inside. Lighting his way with a flashlight, he tried to find his friend, but he became strangely quiet and suddenly stopped. A few steps away from him, he found someone else's flashlight on the floor. The man did not understand where it could have come from and, squatting down, reached for it. At that very moment, he felt some liquid drip onto his neck. Nick put his hand behind his head and touched his neck to check what it was. However, when he looked at his bloody palm, his eyes widened in horror. The man pointed the flashlight upward and froze in shock. A bloody Scott looked at him lifelessly from the shelf. Holding the severed head of his first victim, Edgar, in Scott's voice, said that he was here. Nick couldn't bring himself to move because of such a terrible picture. The last thing he thought about in the moment before he died was that Scott had been right. The enemy was already here. As he devoured the second man's body, Edgar thought contentedly that he simply had a talent for fishing. He simply loved his new ability, imitation. It made his work much easier and allowed him to remain in the shadows until the very end, without giving himself away in any way. In the cargo hold, among the creatures that Bill kept in that container, Edgar also discovered red worm larvae. These are giant earthworms that live mostly on desert planets. They had the ability to imitate the sounds made by other living creatures. Some believe that these worms had evolved to become more effective at hunting other creatures in harsh environments. Having eaten them, our hero also acquired this ability, but it was significantly inferior to its original. Setting some restrictions, he could only imitate the voice of his last victim. He lifted Nick's head towards him and opened his mouth, deciding that even so, this skill had helped him a lot. He devoured both of his victims, leaving only pools of red blood behind him. After Edgar came out of there and licking the blood from his paws, our hero decided that tomorrow he would have dinner with Peter from the catering establishment. Finding a ventilation hole near one of the walls, he quickly unscrewed the bolts on the grate, after which he climbed inside, thinking that he would need to visit Ray because he had not visited her for quite a long time. So before returning to the nest, he decided to go to the laboratory. Suddenly, a familiar thin voice sounded in his head. Edgar touched his neck in bewilderment. He could never even imagine that he would be able to communicate with creatures that speak through waves, using this extrasensory organ. Straining, he tried to greet Ray. She heard him and said that she was still hungry today and really wanted to eat. Edgar was pleasantly surprised to notice that her vocabulary had increased significantly since their last meeting, and assumed that the psionium had some effect that he was not aware of. As he moved on, our hero apologized to Ray, saying that it would be quite problematic to get food today. When the amoeba asked what the difficulty was, Edgar replied that people could catch him. It hurt him to hear his friend's sad voice, but he could no longer use the old passage. After the head of the research team's body disappeared, the head of security increased the lab security to the maximum, and now even the ventilation ducts were at risk of detection. It is for this reason that he has not been able to bring Ray bars for several days now. All he was capable of doing in the current situation was talking to her. After talking with her for a few more minutes, Edgar said goodbye, saying that he had to go now. He crawled further, hoping that he would soon come up with a way to get into the laboratory. Our hero understood that he would be able to free Ray only after he evolved, but the problem was that it was quite difficult to do this quickly. Typically, the user in the game had to kill at least 10 representatives of 2 intelligent races and obtain gene essences from them. This was the only way to move to a new stage of evolution. But since there were only people on this ship, its evolution was impossible under the current conditions. Suddenly, with the help of his hypersensitivity, he noticed someone. Directly below him was Richard, talking to someone on his earpiece. Edgar listened carefully to his conversation, trying to figure out who the head of the crisis management department was talking to. He, not noticing the stranger's presence, continued on his way, telling his interlocutor that for now, everything was going according to plan, and there was nothing to worry about. Hearing that the order had come from the chief, Richard paused for a moment, and his face showed great surprise. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and, closing his eyes, said that he had no right to question the decisions of the top brass. He then went on to say that in any case, the ship would arrive at Planet 08 according to plan. Edward could not contain his surprise when he heard that all of Captain George's orders were being written down. Richard stopped at the door to the conference room and placed his hand on the scanner, telling his interlocutor that he was happy to fulfill the U family's field. After the door opened, he cut the connection and went inside. Edgar was deep in thought, and from the conversation he overheard, he was able to learn that this little man was a cunning fox who had betrayed the captain of this ship, and that he should watch Richard to see if his evil plans would harm him. Once all the heads were gathered together, George, not hiding his anger, pounced on the head of security, asking how he was even doing his job. Pavel just lowered his head in shame, dropping more apologies. This infuriated the captain even more, and he furiously shouted that all this time he had only heard empty apologies, and their meeting with the pirates was in only 2 days, and they still hadn't figured out anything at all. The head of the security department bowed and said hesitantly that they had increased the number of surveillance cameras and security. But George was no longer listening to him, turning in the other direction. He called out to the head of the navigation department, asking how many people were already missing. He replied that, including the former head of the logistics department, there were 8 people. Edgar, as usual, watched from above as the ship's leader raged in despair. Holding back the giggles that were bursting out, he was even ready to sympathize with this man, because they had no way of knowing that the enemy was constantly near them. Having cursed everyone present, George sank down into his chair, exhausted, and closed his eyes wearily. Suddenly, Richard said that he had also checked everything and had come to the conclusion that the head of security had done everything he could and that he should not be blamed. George looked at him with a look full of irritation and asked why Richard was protecting him when the criminal was still freely roaming their ship. In response, Richard said with emphasis that the captain should calm down and listen carefully to what he was about to say. After that, he stood up from his seat and explained that by human standards, no man would be able to cover his tracks after all the crimes he had committed, even though the metal gremlin was just a rumor. But perhaps they were really attacked by someone whose existence they did not even suspect. These words of Richard made our hero tense up. Here, Michael intervened and said that all this time, there was an artificial intelligence on their ship, and if there really was some kind of foreign living creature here, it would have been discovered long ago. Richard replied in a serious tone that he had served in the army and was well acquainted with the principle of operation of AI. Afterwards, he reminded everyone that in the container that the former head of the logistics department had brought with him, all the cryo chambers were broken and emptied. Frowning, he asked where those who had been imprisoned in them all this time had gone. Pavel and Jacob tensed up. No one present had an explanation for this, of course, with the exception of our hero, watching from above. Hearing Richard's words, he realized that he had made a serious mistake. George sighed wearily and said with a skeptical expression that even if we assume that there really is a space monster running around their ship, then how will Richard explain where this very monster is wandering, since no one has seen it? The head of the crisis management department stood up from his seat and pointed somewhere, saying that there was one more place they had not inspected. Everyone followed his direction with their eyes and looked at the ventilation hole in the ceiling with bewilderment. Richard explained that the ventilation ducts were located along the perimeter of the entire ship, and their height was about a meter, which ensured fairly comfortable movement along them, considering that the metal gremlin was no more than 80 centimeters high. But despite this, it could single-handedly destroy an entire battleship. As soon as the conversation turned to this, our hero immediately crawled away, but so that he could hear the conversation from below. He thought with displeasure that he should have taken the risk and destroyed this guy earlier, while he had the chance. Meanwhile, in the conference room, everyone began to look at each other. Thinking about what to do, Richard suggested to just take this monster alive if possible and hand it over to the NS. This way they could avoid their wrath as well. He explained that if they could establish that it was the monster that ate Alex, then it would actually work when Jacob asked what they should do with the pirates then, to which, since there would still be no body by that time, they would have to fight. George thought carefully about all the information he had received. Looking at Richard, he asked how many soldiers he would need, to which he replied that out of 8 squads he would take 6 men. The captain nodded in agreement, giving his approval to check the ventilation shafts. Hearing this, our hero, with blazing rage in his eyes, turned around and walked away. There was no point in him listening to this conversation any longer. As he got rid of more screws, he reflected that his existence had been unknown for a long time, and that sooner or later he would have to face such a situation. Having climbed out of the ventilation pipe, he carefully returned the grate back. After that, he jumped down into his shelter. He understood that now he would have to make an important choice. If he left his nest, he would have nowhere else to go. The corridors were stuffed with cameras, and the ventilation shafts would also become unusable. Leaning back into the green swamp created from his own acid, Edgar weighed whether it was better to run or try to resist. The green liquid pleasantly enveloped his body, helping our hero to relax. As soon as he closed his eyes for a moment, the image of Richard appeared before him, revealing his existence to everyone. This man awakened in Edgar an unusually strong rage that he had never felt before. He was infuriated by this man's proposal to take him, amorph, alive, like some wild animal from a very ordinary planet. For our hero, this race meant a lot. Its representatives could bite the neck of their enemy. Even if all their limbs were cut off and only one head remained, Richard's words deeply hurt Edgar. A furious roar erupted from his mouth. Our hero was determined to use every possible means to show the humans the true greatness of Amorph. He placed his paws on the green surface, activating his abilities. In a couple of moments, a huge red puddle formed beneath it, from which red threads rushed to all the pipes. Using the communications allowed him to know what was happening throughout the ship at once. Thus, he learned that the ship's personnel had already begun searching the ship, starting with inspecting the compartments and ending with tracking the location and movement of enemies. If we assume that the ship cutting through space was a living being, then Edgar could equate himself to a parasite living in the brain, capable of intercepting all incoming information. The ship's captain and department heads quickly moved to the command compartment. The hero assumed that Richard would take command as the responsible person for this plan. His armed soldiers had already penetrated the ventilation pipes and began to explore them, dividing into several groups of 2 or 3 people. With all this information, Edgar had already managed to determine the main points of his plan. He decided to figure out everything else as he went along, depending on the enemy's movements and weapons. Smiling, our hero went to greet his guests. Meanwhile, all the soldiers had already taken their positions, and the leader of Team A announced that they were beginning the operation. The communications officer from the task force contacted the captain of Team B and asked for a status report. B1 reported that everyone was in position and also ready to begin the operation. In response, Ethan informed B1 that the connection was too bad and said to study everything carefully again. Richard and George watched everything closely through the cameras. Richard was completely convinced that a monster was behind Alexa's death, although he was originally supposed to eliminate her himself. His basic plan remained unchanged. Only now he needed to reduce the number of variables as much as possible and not allow anything out of the ordinary to happen before the head of the Yu family arrived here. He was determined to get rid of the monster lurking on the ship before today was over. Without taking his eyes off the monitor, the communications officer informed A1 that there was a fork ahead where they needed to turn right. At 3, he said that the connection was still very bad, so he needed to check the equipment again and move on. He replied that he would contact Ethan as soon as he completed all the work. Richard, standing nearby, said that this route was very difficult and asked to tell the members of the reconnaissance team to move carefully. Ethan nodded and contacted the teams again, telling them to take their time and search everything thoroughly. Richard frowned slightly when he noticed something on the cameras. He turned his gaze to the communications officer and reported that the camera at B3 was showing the same picture. Ethan replied that he would pass it on right away. He then looked down at the cameras and contacted B3, asking him to check the camera, but there was no answer, so Ethan repeated his request again. A few moments later, the image from camera B3 changed and began to move, and the soldier himself responded that everything was fixed. The signalman contacted B2, telling him to link up with B3, who was behind him, and continue moving. Using sensors, it was clear that soldier B2 had turned around and was heading towards his lagging partner. B3 slowly moved towards him. Less than a minute later, they collided. As soon as this happened, everyone heard heart-rending screams that terrified the heads of departments in the headquarters. Richard leaned forward slightly, keeping his eyes on the cameras as B2 shouted that it was here. But immediately after that, the connection with the soldier was broken. The man gritted his teeth. Everything went completely differently than he expected. Ethan tried to contact B3, finally losing contact with B2. He replied that the creature had dragged B2 away. The communications officer said that the cameras couldn't see anything and asked for details. When the soldier said that due to the surprise attack, further inspection of the area was impossible, Pavel and Jacob were shocked. Turning to Ethan, they simultaneously asked in an excited tone, what the hell was going on there? Richard was as shocked as the others. He couldn't even imagine that this monster would deal with everyone so quickly. Even for experienced assassins, it would be difficult to face armed soldiers with enhanced equipment. Relying on this, he was overconfident. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his skin. Only now did Richard realize the full fatality of his hasty assumption that this creature was at the level of an ordinary animal. In fact, it turned out to be much smarter and more agile. Turning to the signalman, he ordered that all soldiers be given a message that they could open fire if they noticed even the slightest movement, and also that B1 was to join up with B3 and together find B2. Ethan hastened to carry out his order. Contacting B1, he relayed Richard's words to him, and moments later, he received a report from the soldier that they were beginning to search for their missing partner. Richard, meanwhile, was trying to come up with a way out of the current situation, because it was quite obvious that if everything continued in the same spirit, then all the soldiers would simply die, and their sacrifice would be meaningless. He could not allow this in any way. Through the sensors, everyone watched as B3 moved towards B1, which was waiting for it. At that moment, Richard's attention was drawn to the excited voice of V1, who reported that he heard something nearby and asked what the sound was. The soldier explained that he was unable to determine the target being determined due to the fork in the road. When, moments later, the soldier corrected his report that the source of the sound was B3, Richard breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan also couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief and told B1 to report to him once he had teamed up with B3. However, when there was no response from the soldier, the excitement returned. A few moments later, B1 informed everyone that their enemy had taken B3. Richard immediately put on Ethan's equipment and contacted the soldier, informing him that the head of the department was currently in contact with him and asked for a more detailed report of the situation. When he was told that it all happened so quickly that the soldier did not have time to see anything, the man turned purple with anger and shouted out in bewilderment a question about how this could have happened, because the enemy was right under his nose. Nicholas and Ethan looked at him in surprise. For the first time in a long time, the cold-blooded Richard was losing his temper. Unable to restrain himself, he threw the equipment onto the floor, cursing loudly. He couldn't believe that all this time none of them had noticed this creature, which was always somewhere nearby, and was now just playing with them. Richard didn't want to think that this creature had such advanced intelligence that it had never been caught on camera by the soldiers, deliberately avoiding filming. His eyes widened in surprise at the sudden realization. He bent down and reached for the equipment lying on the floor. The man put it back on, thinking it over again. He then forcefully ordered Soldier B1 to state his name. When there was no answer, he repeated his order, causing George to look genuinely confused. Richard's worst suspicions were confirmed when a soldier's laughter was heard on the other side, and he admitted that he had been found out. At that very moment, the B1 camera captured someone's four-fingered paw, and immediately after that, the image became covered with numerous cracks. Nicholas and Paul froze in horror, refusing to believe what they had just seen. The picture was no longer transmitted because the camera was broken. Shocked, Jacob couldn't stay on his feet and fell to the floor, not taking his eyes off the screen. Richard's face was no less shocked than his colleagues, and the leader of Group A contacted him and asked what was going on there. But the head of the department didn't hear him at all. He quietly gritted his teeth, analyzing what had just happened. With the camera out of the way, Eric was relieved to finally be done with Team B. Thanks to a tip he received from Ray, he was able to disable the soldiers' communications equipment using wave radiation. It was because of them that B3, who was walking behind everyone, constantly heard interference. Our hero had no trouble getting rid of the soldier, who was busy fixing his equipment with his new combination skill poison glands, after which everything else went like clockwork. While devouring the body of his victim, Edgar mentally thanked Richard because thanks to him, today he would be able to eat until he was full. Next up for him was Team A. He activated his hypersensitivity to understand where the soldiers were now. His ability could spread over a fairly large radius, so he had no problems finding it. And then a minute later, he finally found 3 people in full combat readiness. Edgar immediately headed towards them. He knew he had to be careful this time, because his opponent now knew he was able to imitate the human voice. He moved extremely carefully, peering out from around the corner. Our hero was aware that there was a fork in the road ahead from which Team A would emerge very soon. Suddenly, a proverb popped into his mind. Knowledge is power. And another brilliant idea immediately appeared in his head. He understood perfectly well that incomplete knowledge could turn out to be poison, which he was going to use. The soldiers of Group A confidently walked forward, carefully examining the space around them. Having stopped, the squad leader contacted the control and said that this was A1, and they were now at a fork in the road and were going to continue moving to the right. When the department leader approved their actions, the squad moved forward. Richard reminded them that the enemy was able to imitate the human voice, so they were allowed to open fire immediately if they heard anything like that. As soon as he said this, someone's cry for help was heard from around the corner. A1 immediately stopped and told his partners that it was the enemy. They opened fire on his orders. Edgar expected this, so he was able to quickly move out of the line of fire. After waiting a few moments, A1 gave a hand signal to stop the attack. After that, they moved forward, looking around with even greater concentration. Richard's voice coming from the microphone ordered everyone to hold their positions and cover A1 in case of danger. But none of them could even predict the plan of our hero, who, hiding in the shadows, was now following right behind the group of soldiers. A3 was completely focused on the road in front of him and completely oblivious to the threat looming over him in the form of Edgar's paws. When his cry of horror was heard, the soldiers in front immediately turned around. The shocked group leader informed command that the enemy had been behind them the whole time. Holding one of the soldiers hostage, Edward waited for the humans to react further. When A1 and A2 received the order to open fire, they shouted out that they could not do it. A1 explained that the enemy had taken A3 hostage and hidden behind him, so there was a high probability that they would hit a comrade instead of the monster. Richard let out a shout, ordering the squad leader to immediately open fire and finally shoot at the monster, who raised his weapon, aiming. The soldiers opened fire simultaneously, following the orders of their superiors. Edgar threw aside the now useless body of his victim and began to run. The bullets flew past him at a tangent, hitting him every now and then. As soon as he came across a fork in the road, our hero immediately disappeared around the bend. He left behind acidic drops that burned through the surface of the tunnels. As soon as the enemy disappeared, the soldiers stopped pursuing him and returned to their comrade. A1 informed his superiors that A3 was in shock and urgently needed an injection. While administering the drug to his comrade, the group leader reported every action to Richard. A few moments later, A3 let out a sigh of relief and lost consciousness. Having reported this, A1 announced that they were now going to continue the mission. By chance, his gaze caught on something that caught his attention. He pointed out to his partner a green acid stain on the floor and suggested that the monster was injured. He trembled slightly with horror. He was even afraid to remember the terrible monster they had encountered a couple of minutes ago. As the team leader, Thomas walked ahead and carefully peered around the corner, trying to locate the enemy. With the help of the acidic trails left by the monsters, this was not particularly difficult, and they moved along the trail left behind, keeping their weapons at the ready. Contacting his superiors, Thomas requested permission to introduce an amplifier for more effective suppression. Richard didn't answer right away, But when the soldier finally received his approval, he immediately touched the display on his suit, performing all the necessary manipulations. The drug he administered worked immediately. Hellish pain pierced his entire body. Unable to withstand the load, he fell to his knees, leaning his palms on the floor. In an attempt to contain the pain, he clenched his fists, leaving deep indentations on the floor. Watching his leader suffer, Douglas said he would kill this monster no matter what it cost him. By this time, Thomas had already managed to come to his senses, and rising to his feet again, said that he would do this only after him. As soon as they took a couple of steps forward, they saw in front of them a fairly wide hole in the floor, eaten away by acid. Thomas came closer and looked inside. After contacting his superiors, he reported that they had discovered a hole in the ventilation duct, after which he added that the monster could have descended through it into the corridor. When Richard asked to be told the exact location where it happened, Thomas replied that it was the 6th sector near the utility zone. None of them suspected that they had once again fallen into our hero's trap. Edgar jumped down, drawing attention to himself. Douglas turned around instantly and looked at the monster with a shocked expression on his face. He immediately opened fire, but Edward ran forward, completely ignoring the bullets flying at him. He didn't even have to dodge because all the bullets flew past. This greatly surprised the soldier, and he did not stop shooting. Having gotten close enough to him, the hero grabbed the soldier by the head. He didn't even have time to do anything before he was knocked off his feet and thrown with force onto the floor. Thomas watched this horrific scene from the side. His mind was completely overwhelmed by anger, and his eyes changed their color to gold due to the overwhelming emotions that needed to be released. Rushing towards the enemy, he opened fire. The hero reacted immediately, holding out the body of the soldier he had just killed in front of him as a shield. When the stream of bullets stopped, Edgar began to move towards the soldier, his pointed tail sticking out in front of him. Thomas knocked the enemy's tail away with his weapon when it tried to attack him. Then he raised his fist to strike and jumped straight towards Edgar. The hero was surprised by the extraordinary speed of this man, who in a couple of moments found himself right next to him. However, Thomas's blow landed on the floor because Edgar managed to dodge. Immediately after this, he started to run, leaving the soldier behind. Grabbing his weapon, Thomas fired another endless stream of bullets, but they barely hit the monster, which soon disappeared around the next corner. From a feeling of hopelessness and dull rage, he screamed at the top of his lungs. Our hero, meanwhile, moved further and further away from that place. Taking turn after turn, Edgar didn't stop for a moment. It was only when he felt he was relatively safe that he was finally able to stop and catch his breath. The soldier's abilities made him very scared, so he decided that if he didn't want to die, he needed to change his strategy. He began to think actively about what other trick he could use. A few moments later, another bright idea came to his head, and he remembered that there was a surviving soldier left in one of the corridors. A3 had already managed to come to his senses, but it was very difficult for him to move on his own. Hearing someone's footsteps approaching, he looked up to see who it was. A few moments later, the monster's head appeared from around the corner. Edgar looked around. Satisfied that they were alone, he emerged completely from his hiding place and ran towards the immobilized soldier. He watched the monster that had stopped next to him with eyes full of horror and tears. When he leaned his head against his helmet, the man couldn't help but scream. Then Edgar, with one movement, knocked him to the floor, pressing down on him with his paw. A moment later, its sharp claws pierced his flesh, causing an even louder cry of pain to come from the soldier's throat. Smiling widely, the hero tore out the man's heart, sending blood spray all around. Edgar absorbed the organ he had torn out in a matter of seconds and switched to the body. He mercilessly bit into the flesh of his victim, tearing off piece after piece. When there was practically nothing left of the soldier, Edgar licked his lips, thinking that this should help him. With his paws, he turned over the remains of his victim. He then took his helmet, fully confident that the others had already learned that A3 had been attacked. His guess was confirmed by the switched-on camera attached to the helmet. Having unhooked it, Edgar began to trample it with his paw, disabling the device. Just a few moments later, the image from that camera was no longer transmitted. Upon receiving notification of the attack on A3, Thomas immediately headed towards it. A couple of minutes later, he noticed the bloody body of a soldier ahead and called out to him, asking if he was okay, but there was no answer. Stopping next to him, Thomas called out to A3 again, but he showed no signs of life. He realized that things were bad, and grabbing A3's hand, began to press on the sensors, injecting him with medicine. At that moment, Thomas saw something burst out of his comrade's stomach and pierce his throat. He instantly recoiled, struck by Edgar's poison. Choking on his own blood, Thomas fell to the floor. Meanwhile, the sound of tearing flesh was heard behind him. Thomas turned around in horror to check what it was. His eyes were met with the horrific sight of a bloody monster crawling out of the A3 suit. The surviving soldier broke out in a cold sweat. With his last strength, he tried to crawl away from there, but the monster followed him, not intending to let its victim escape. Suddenly, Thomas felt the monster's paws grab his neck and head. Lifting him into the air, Edgar pulled off his protective helmet. Afterwards, he came as close as possible to him and whispered wishes for a pleasant appetite to himself. Upon hearing this, Thomas looked at him with fear in his eyes, realizing that this was his end. Having got rid of the last soldier, our hero moved on, thinking about what his enemy's next actions might be. He assumed that there were still about 90 soldiers left on board, and those who heard his warning would attack him with all their might as soon as they saw him. He was also aware of the problem of the lack of reinforced equipment, but this was a mere trifle for him, because the main problem for him was the armament of the military. As he made his way towards his target, Edgar was well aware that the plasma guns were a danger to him, so he had to try to avoid encountering them. In the game, plasma weapons were quite well known. It was a powerful technique used in various battles and was most often used to destroy ships and tanks. Typically, due to the weapon's immense power, its dimensions were heavy enough to be lifted by one person and required at least 2 people to use it. So, people created a light version in the form of a machine gun, which immediately gained enormous popularity. But despite this, heavy weapons such as plasma launchers were continuously supplied to the mega corporation. Edgar hoped that since this ship was an exploration type, it would not have such destructive weapons. Suddenly, he froze a meter from the grate, hearing bewildered cries from below. George was furious and demanded an explanation from Richard, asking where this monster came from and what the hell was going on here. The head of the crisis management department explained that Bill had one unregistered creature on his supply list, and most likely that was the monster. When Edgar heard that the captain had lent Richard enhanced equipment specifically to catch the monster, our hero calmed down a little. He knew that this equipment played the role of a life preserver in space and was quite an expensive pleasure. The thought that the desire to cut costs would only lead to a shortening of their own lives brought a satisfied smile to Edgar. Meanwhile, Richard responded to the captain's earlier attack by saying that if they had had good equipment, they would not have had to endure failures, which irritated George even more. Completely ignoring the captain's face, distorted with displeasure, he continued saying that in addition to this, he had information that their enemy was an incredibly dangerous creature with high intelligence and was capable of imitating someone else's speech. The words he said shocked George. Without taking his eyes off the ship's captain, Richard said that gathering information on the battlefield was of paramount importance and that they should now reconsider their actions based on the information received. George had no choice but to admit that he was right and agree to adjust the plan. Jacob and Pavel understood exactly what was going on and rushed to intervene before something irreparable happened, shouting that they couldn't do it because this weapon was designed to fight pirates, and after using it, there would be practically nothing left of their ship. They would all simply die, finding themselves in open space. Edgar crawled closer, listening to the conversation with interest. Thanks to the convenient location of the ventilation hole, he could see everyone present and determine his next victim. His choice fell on the director of the laboratory, who exhausts Ray day after day. He raised his paw over the bars, deciding that there was no point in delaying any further. The next moment, under the pressure of our hero, the grate flew off to the side with a crash. The sound caught Richard's attention, who immediately turned around to check what it was. Edgar, who had flown out of the ventilation, immediately attacked the laboratory director and began to bite into his head, not paying attention to his heartbreaking screams. The department heads who were nearby, having become involuntary witnesses to such a cruel scene, recoiled in fear, not taking their eyes off the enemy. When Edgar was finished with his victim, he chose the next one and pounced on it. Loudly, screaming in horror that there was a monster here, Jacob rushed away. Ethan did not hesitate and immediately decided to report what was happening here to all the other crew members. But before he could say a few words, Edgar's sharp tail pierced his throat, making it impossible for him to say anything. As he pulled the tail out of its body, red blood gushed out of its punctured throat. Suddenly, our hero felt a piercing pain. Turning around, he saw that they were shooting at him. At that moment, images of his possible terrible future burst into his head. His eyes widened in fear as he realized that his fears about the plasma cannon had been confirmed after all. Edgar turned his gaze to Richard standing in front of him. Now he knew that this man had with him that very colossally expensive but light and deadly weapon. If you attack him in the head or chest, then the instant death of the enemy will be guaranteed for sure. Richard himself also kept his eyes on him, holding an ordinary gun at the ready. Suddenly his eyebrows drew together, frowning. He threw his weapon aside, saying with displeasure that since the monster had noticed, there was no point in continuing this circus, after which he reached for something in his inner cloak pocket. Under the puzzled looks of Jacob and George, he took out a plasma gun from there. At the sight of her, our hero slowly backed away. Richard chuckled and said that although he didn't know what Edgar was, he had a wild feeling of déjà vu. His smile grew wider, and his eyes grew wilder as he said that this was the second time he had encountered a monster that could use multiple abilities, just like his mistress, Maria Yu. Having said this, he fired the cannon. Our hero managed to dodge the deadly attack at the last moment, and the laser charge simply shattered on the stone slab. But Richard didn't stop there. He continued firing the cannon at the monster, hoping to hit it. Using his instincts, Edgar successfully avoided each of the attacks, moving towards the shelter he had noticed earlier. As soon as he disappeared behind one of the tables, Richard stopped the attack and said that during this time, they had already managed to go through a whole host of options of who their enemy really was. Edgar didn't listen to him at all. Finding himself safe, he was breathing heavily, realizing that he was on the verge of death. But panic quickly gave way to a smile at the thought that in any game, there are always risks, and the only possible winner every time was he, Amorph. So no matter what happened next, our hero was completely confident in his victory this time too. Usually in his past world, everyone depicted predators like bears, lions, and wolves as symbols of terrifying violence. But in reality, everything was completely different. Edgar considered the real predator to be the one who rationally assessed his strength and avoided a fight if it was beyond his strength. Playing as Amorph, he firmly learned that cowardly caution was the main distinguishing feature of a predator, because no matter how strong the characteristics were, everything would be useless if you were not careful. When Richard fired again, Edgar barely had time to duck. Activating his hypersensitivity, he noted that his opponent was indeed good. The hero analyzed Richard's indicators, assessing his current condition. A few moments later, he could already say with certainty that this man smelled exactly like him, an experienced predator. Avoiding further attacks, Edgar jumped behind another table, hiding there. But this shelter did not serve him for long, because the next moment, another laser beam flew past him, burning through the metal. George couldn't stand to watch Richard fire indiscriminately, destroying everything around him, and shouted that he shouldn't forget that they were now in the central hub of their ship. He glanced in his direction and said with displeasure that he was already acting with the utmost caution. Having said this, he returned to the battle. Dropping to one knee, Richard fired again. Edgar managed to rush past him and, without being wounded, hide behind a new shelter. The man clicked his tongue in irritation. He was already getting pretty fed up with the monster's evasiveness. Carefully peeking out from behind his cover, he looked at Richard. Thanks to the activated ability, the hero realized that it was a trick. Taking advantage of the delay, the head of the Critical Situations Management Department called for reinforcements, reporting that the monster was attacking the operational headquarters on the bridge. Only now did Edgar figure out his plan. All this time, this man was shooting at him as if he really was going to kill him. But it was just a test. He planned to stall for time to keep the captain safe. Suddenly, a predatory smile appeared on his face. While thinking about how he could finish everything before armed soldiers arrived, he accidentally noticed a fire extinguisher under the table. Taking it carefully in his hands, Edgar thought that this little thing had come in handy here. The next moment, without hesitation, he pulled the pin. Chuckling quietly, the hero aimed the hose straight at his opponent. A white fog instantly filled the entire room, preventing everyone present from seeing anything. Richard covered his nose and mouth with his hand, still holding the gun at the ready, and shouted that such a cheap trick would not stop him. He then fired blindly, but both laser beams missed our hero. The rest of the people, unlike the head of the Crisis Management Department, succumbed to panic, losing the ability to see who was a friend and who was an enemy. Hearing their confused and fearful voices, Richard shouted out that they had not been given weapons for decoration. When he returned to fight the monster, he realized with horror that it had disappeared again among the smoke. Edgar chuckled to himself when the man belatedly realized what was happening and ordered the captain to be taken out of here immediately. He himself had already managed to find a new victim and infect her with his poison. Not allowing him to move, Edgar opened his mouth and sank his teeth into the soft flesh, tearing off piece after piece. The marshal called out to Richard, asking where he was, and from somewhere in front, the voice of the head of the department immediately came, saying that he was here. However, when another voice came from behind him, informing him that the department head was here, Marshall was confused. Meanwhile, our hero had crept up behind the man, who shouted that they should not give in to these provocations of a monster who was simply trying to confuse them. A moment later, he suffered the same fate as the rest of Edgar's victims. Suddenly, Marshall heard the voice of the head of the navigation department, who shouted that the monster had already killed Richard. He was pulled out of his state of shock by another voice, which told him that he should not believe these tricks, because the monster was cleverly imitating other people's voices. Several voices simultaneously told Marshall completely contradictory things, driving him crazy. He turned towards one voice and then another, keeping his gun at gunpoint. When one of the voices began to shout that he could not hesitate and shoot immediately because the enemy was right in front of him. Not knowing who to believe, Marshall closed his eyes, sent everything to hell, and fired. A few moments later, a quiet curse was heard from the side. Richard miraculously managed to step aside in time, sacrificing his arm. Hissing in pain, he looked at his burned hand, assessing the damage. Feeling a presence behind him, he immediately turned around. Richard fired twice immediately, finally finding the enemy's location. Edgar didn't expect the enemy to be able to notice him, so one of the lasers managed to hit him before he dodged the attack. He turned around and ran in the opposite direction. Noticeable changes began to occur in his body. On their backs, two small appendages sprouted large wings. Opening them, he jumped up and turned in the air, rushing towards his opponent, growling furiously. He froze in shock as Edgar's speed increased significantly. Before Richard could even comprehend what had happened, his head was torn off his shoulders. His dead body fell limply to the ground. Our hero landed a few meters away from him. Leaving behind bloody traces, the hero moved on. Noticing someone's silhouette in the thick fog, the marshal pointed his weapon at him and hesitantly asked who it was. When the monster emerged from the fog, his body broke out in a cold sweat. But as soon as the monster came close to him, a loud scream came from Marshall's mouth, and a grimace of horror froze on his face. Richard's bloody face looked out from the monster's mouth, his eyes wide and surprised. After standing there for a while, Edgar walked past, holding the severed head of the Critical Situations Management Department in his mouth as a trophy. Struck by what he saw, Marshall was afraid to even move, so as not to attract the monster's attention once again. But our hero didn't touch anyone else. Having fulfilled his goal, he jumped back into the ventilation hole in the ceiling. He wouldn't have minded staying a little longer and slowly eating all that meat, but right now, Edgar had other things to take care of. Once the smoke cleared and reinforcements arrived, George snapped at the soldiers. He asked in bewilderment how they could even perform their duties at such a speed. It was quite difficult for the young specialist to inspect the place where disfigured corpses were scattered everywhere. Such a terrible picture made them want to vomit every now and then. Having ordered the soldiers to immediately get down to their business, he turned around and walked a couple of steps to the side. Sometime later, he was called out and informed that the identification of the victims had already been completed. George approached the medic and asked with hope in his voice if there were any survivors. The man shook his head and said that everyone had died except the leader of the research group. The ship's captain was greatly surprised to learn that senior researcher Thomas had survived and was now being taken to the recovery room. The medic explained that Thomas was immune to the monster's toxins, but suffered irreversible, serious damage to his senses of sight, smell, and taste. The news that such a talented soldier would have to breathe through a tube for the rest of his life did not please George at all. When William asked why they didn't just surrender to the space dogs, anger flashed in the captain's eyes. Prepared for his reaction, William closed his eyes and said that all the people here just wanted to live their lives and not go through this hell. George turned around and replied that he didn't have time for this useless talk now. They all needed to get back to their work. He still found it hard to believe that so many people had died in a fight with just one monster. Besides this, the head of the research, technical, medical, supply department, navigation department, and the crisis management group all died. If their ship collided with pirates now, there would simply be no survivors. Stopping, he even began to consider the idea that he should just drop everything and run away, saving his life. He was torn from these thoughts by the voice of one of the soldiers, who had discovered a strange pistol. Hearing this, he called out to the soldiers collecting the bodies and ordered them to bring the weapons to him. They immediately carried out the order and handed him the pistol they had found. George immediately recognized it as Richard's weapon, examining the laser gun. He determined that the charge was about 60%. Although it was covered with a couple of cracks, it could still be used for self-defense. Having hidden the weapon, he left the room. Meanwhile, our hero moved to his lair, where he managed to significantly worsen the condition of the pipes. He was counting on the fact that if the system reported a problem, it would take a significant amount of time to process it. Now he was planning to expand his nest. Edgar already had 3 nests in cryo chambers, so he should choose a new location. The first option that came to his mind was the canteen. Food was the most important thing for survival, so he could spoil the food and cut off his enemy's supply. The second, no less suitable place, he considered the military equipment warehouse, where all the plasma installations were stored. If people decided to resort to using it, our hero would not have a chance. The last option was the lab because it contained a large number of different genetic samples and ionium, but the problem for Edgar was that the probability of obtaining characteristics from the samples was less than 10%. Only with the help of ionium could he awaken the full power of the individual and thus prepare for a skirmish with pirates or meeting with other possible enemies. Having decided that he would place nests in the dining room and laboratory, and that he would simply steal the plasma installation and use it himself, our hero left his lair. As he climbed into the sewer hole, he noticed that he hadn't really cared about it before, but what Richard had said still haunted him. Although he didn't know for sure who Dominic Yu was and who he served, Edgar suspected him of conspiring with the pirates. He knew that there was nothing more frightening than an unknown enemy, so he should get as much information as possible. Guided by such thoughts, he was heading towards the laboratory when he suddenly heard Ray's joyful voice. Peering cautiously around the corner, Edgar noted that she was in high spirits today. After making sure that no one was there, he went out and voiced his thoughts to Ray that she was in a better mood today than in their previous meetings, and she replied that she had not been in pain today. The hero stopped a meter from the bars, thinking that while the little people were hiding in their rooms, he could experiment a little. Deciding that he should be bolder, he moved forward. At that very moment, the sensors installed on the ceiling lit up red. Everything around was filled with a yak-red glow, and subtle vibrations emanated from the sensors, transmitting a signal of danger. Edward sat motionless, studying the device carefully. When Ray asked what it was doing, the hero asked her to wait a bit. He sat like this for about half an hour, but no one came to the signal. This incident helped him understand that these were all just dummies, which were intended to intimidate him. And since he no longer had to move with bated breath, he moved on to more decisive actions. With one blow, Edgar knocked out the grate, and it fell to the floor with a crash. Immediately after this, the hero himself went down, stopping near the cryo chamber in which Ray was imprisoned. He said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Edward looked at her carefully and noticed that the color of her body indicated that she looked quite healthy. He was worried that if he just left her here, she would die of starvation, so it would be better to take her with him. Without taking his eyes off Ray's pink body, who was cheerfully waving her paws at him, the hero thought about the fact that, thanks to its characteristics, the bubble amoeba is not picky about food and is immune to toxins, so it can be safely left in the nest or taken with you. Turning to Ray, he asked if she wanted to leave here, and she asked with confusion where to get out from. Edgar explained to her that if she wanted, he would help her get out of the laboratory, and she happily replied that she wanted it. He nodded and walked a few meters away from the cryo chamber, warning her to be careful. After that, he lifted off the floor and rushed at full speed straight towards the cryo chamber. Edgar easily broke through the thick glass with his body and picked up Ray in his arms before she could fall. She quickly jumped onto her friend's shoulder and happily thanked him for his help. The hero had to take her off himself and put her on the floor, after which he asked Ray to wait a little while he finished with one thing. When she asked where he was going, Edgar replied that he was going to make a nest. Having explained everything to her, he immediately got down to business. Opening his mouth, he ejected a strong stream of green liquid. It spun around, filling the entire space with its toxins. Ray jumped happily a little away from him, watching what was happening with interest. A few minutes later, the entire lab was filled with sticky green clots. Edgar looked over his work appraisingly. He was sure that now no one would be able to use this laboratory for its intended purpose. When he felt hungry, he broke the glass and grabbed someone's brain languishing there. He tried to ignore the nasty taste and focus only on the nutrients it contained. He glanced at Ray, who was quite actively absorbing someone else's brain that he had given her. As the hero was about to throw another brain into his mouth, he felt something. Edgar put his brains aside and said, "Ray, that they had guests." He determined that there were only two people at the entrance, one of whom was a soldier and the other a researcher. Throwing Ray back onto his shoulder, the hero hid behind a green wall of his toxins. A few moments later, the entrance door to the laboratory slowly opened. The men standing at the threshold were stunned with horror when they looked inside. With his weapon at the ready, the soldier entered first, looking around carefully, followed by the researcher, covering his nose with his elbow from the terrible stench in the room. The soldier tried to understand what these green roots were that had covered the entire laboratory from top to bottom. Hearing a rustling sound behind him, he immediately turned around. As soon as Edgar rushed at him, the soldier immediately opened fire. But this ordinary weapon could not cause significant damage to our hero. The soldier screamed in fear as the monster loomed over him. With one sharp movement, Edgar pierced the man's body. The poison instantly spread throughout his body, as evidenced by the rapidly swelling green veins on his face. Without bothering with it for long, Edgar simply threw it aside, removing his paw from its body. After that, he moved towards the researcher. Out of fear, he fell to the floor and crawled towards the wall, begging for help. But no one except our heroes heard his screams. Stopping near him, Edward grabbed the man by the head with his paw. He was about to kill him, but suddenly he heard Ray's voice, screaming the word pain. The hero turned his gaze to her and saw that she was actively waving her paws, literally puffing with anger. It wasn't hard for him to guess that this man was one of those who participated in the experiments on her, and now Ray is angry at the researcher for hurting her. Suddenly, an idea came to his mind. Touching his neck with his tail, Edgar injected him with his poison. After that, he lowered it back to the floor. The man looked at him with confusion as the monster brought Ray to him. She immediately understood what Edgar wanted from her and jumped from his arms, taking the form of a star right on the researcher's head. Having wrapped itself around his head, it began to actively absorb his body. Edgar watched this process from the side, taking a new vial with a brain in his hands. He was sure that the instant death that the soldier received was much better than the death of the research from the melting of the head. Deciding it was none of his business, he ripped the lid off the jar and poured someone's brain into his mouth. As soon as he absorbed this brain, a blue system window appeared in front of him. A smile played across his face as the hero realized that he had achieved his goal much faster than he could have imagined. Edgar received a message that a type of physical strength enhancement was now available to him. By this time, Ray had finished absorbing the researcher and slid off his body. When she reached him, Edgar asked her to wait a little while until he finished. After that, he pressed the select button and applied the type change. At that very moment, significant changes began to occur in his body. The muscles in his legs became significantly larger, and his torso became even longer, increasing in size. Ray watched this process with surprise. When she saw that Edgar began to grow, she beamed with joy and joyfully shouted that her friend would become even bigger. A couple of minutes later, our hero's transformation was finally complete. A joyful Ray jumped around him. Watching her, Edgar noted with surprise that she had grown up, which he told her, but she did not understand what he meant. Then he explained to her that she had become an adult. Hearing this, she joyfully jumped up and down. Edgar watched her, thinking that if she was like a liquid, then it was not entirely correct to apply that statement to her as a biologically immature individual. Shaking his head, he decided to explain this to her when Ray learned to speak normally. Suddenly, he felt as if his body had become too heavy and hard for him. He only now noticed the changes that had happened to him. In addition to his height, his hands and nails were covered with hard armor. His legs also became much thicker due to the strengthening properties. The hero called up the system window again and saw that he had 3 new skills added: Natural Healing, Saw Tentacles, and Pollution. Natural Healing combined with Vitality turns into renewable energy. After reading this, Edgar felt a little disappointed. For Amorph, he could obtain an unlimited number of types, but only one of them is not available for use, and the requirements for acquiring a new type are doubled each time. For example, if he first obtained the Super Ability Enhancement type, the number of points of the Physical Strength Enhancement type would increase from 10 to 20. If this were a game, Edgar would be thinking more about the timing of getting the type. Deciding to put the next type on the back burner, he set about testing his new skills in action. When he activated the Saw Tentacle, a spike-like tentacle emerged from his palm. Mentally controlling it, Edgar punched through one of the pillars in the room. He appreciated their attacking power, noting that this skill would be quite useful to him. Next, our hero intended to try out the Pollution ability. Having dropped onto his front paws, he released a stream of poisonous spores. A moment later, the floor a few meters away from him was almost completely cleared of green plaque, and deep traces from the flow of spores releasing acid appeared. Our hero liked this ability even more than the previous one. It was ideal for fighting a powerful enemy. After checking everything he wanted, Edgar headed to his next destination, Ray quickly rushing after him. She jumped on his shoulder and asked where they were going. The hero replied that they were heading to the hangar. He was interested to know how the crew members would behave now if they saw him in a new uniform. Would they burst into tears, or would they immediately run to the evacuation line? 20 minutes later, the ship's crew was running as fast as they could, trying to find shelter in a safe compartment. When the last person ran inside, Dmitri shouted to close the door immediately. Seeing that the person responsible for the doors was shaking with fear against the wall and repeating over and over that they would all die, Dmitri called out to him, hoping to bring the guy to his senses, but he heard absolutely nothing. Then he had to roughly push him aside. Afterwards, Dmitri himself grabbed the lever and pulled it down. The door immediately began to close rapidly. At the last moment, someone's paws reached into the slot, pushing the door back. Edgar didn't have to put much effort into making his way through. When he got inside, a beastly grin played across his face. Dmitri wanted to run away, But from fear, he got tangled up in his legs and fell to the floor. Without taking his eyes off the monster, he slowly crawled back. Edgar, in turn, took a few steps forward, which caused even greater horror in his victims, forcing them to beg for mercy. But our hero was deaf to the people's pleas. With one movement, he chopped off several heads along with other limbs. Those who were further from the entrance began to run, hoping to save their lives. But when Edgar used his skills, all their hopes died along with them. With the last of their strength, someone tried to get out, knocking on the thick glass. But it was all in vain. The ship's solid walls absorbed their dying cries. Thomas, who was in the cryo chamber, had long since come to his senses, and it seemed very strange to him that he did not hear the doctor's steps at all. He tried to clench his hand into a fist, but he couldn't. Thomas did not understand why he was being punished like this. He would have gladly preferred death to such a shameful life. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the door opening. He couldn't see who exactly was coming, so he tried to determine by the sound, by the type of footsteps. If at first Thomas thought it was a soldier, then when his guest stopped right next to the cryo chamber, his empty eye sockets opened in surprise. He realized that the monster had come for him. Edward entered a combination of symbols on the keyboard. Thomas listened carefully, trying to understand what this monster was doing. Suddenly, he felt something soft and pleasant touch his face. However, very soon, this pleasant feeling was replaced by hellish pain when Ray began to absorb all layers of his skin. Thomas felt like his whole head was on fire. Edgar watched all this from the sidelines. He was terribly pleased to watch this little man suffer. 3 hours later, Ray finished and climbed out of the cryo chamber. Edgar was shocked that she ate a man whole. Without taking his eyes off her, he asked if her sense of revenge was now satisfied. But Ray did not understand what he was talking about and asked what revenge was. He turned his gaze to the remains of the skeleton of the former soldier and replied that when a person who caused pain is killed, this is usually called revenge. In response to this, Ray said that it was very tasty for her. This prompted our hero to think that she had absolutely no understanding of what revenge was, and he wondered whether she had not yet learned this, or he was simply born with it. Thinking about this, he wondered with apprehension whether Ray would eventually turn into a sea demon, especially given the increased interest of the researchers in her. In the game, sea demons, like bubble amoebas, lived only on sea planets, and their size usually exceeded 20 meters, and tentacles were hidden in their bodies. Due to the fact that the bubble amoeba resembled the sea demon in its shape, many game users suspected that the two species were related. As far as he remembered, as it turned out later, they were similar simply because the game company was bad at design, and that's why they looked like that. But unlike the game, now for Edgar, everything was more than real. He was distracted from his thoughts by Ray's voice, who said that she was full. Then, under his watchful gaze, she moved from his palms to his favorite shoulder. Having completed all their business here, they went on together. On his way to the lab, Edgar made sure that the nesting process was going smoothly when acidic gas spores began to swell and burst out on the green surface. This could not but please him. The main part of his plan had already been completed. Having left this place, our heroes went in search of their next victim. Meanwhile, in the vicinity of Planet 08, a pirate ship docked with another. Alicia desperately tried to escape from the bandits, but she was quickly caught. The girl, held by two criminals, begged for her husband to be released. Her husband, in turn, rushed towards her, shouting for the pirates to immediately release her. Suddenly, a shot rang out in the room, and a huge stain of blood spread across the man's light suit. The pirates laughed contentedly as they watched this scene, and some of them took the time to count all the stolen wealth. They were ready to kill anyone and everyone who stood in their way. Their brothers found several more people and tied them up, taking them hostage. Alan watched all this with a bored look. He was already beginning to get quite irritated by the fact that all these efforts were being made just for the sake of some pathetic trinkets. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to someone's plaintive voice asking how they could do this to him. Alan listened attentively to some fly's complaint that he had not received a worthy reward after all the work he had done. When he asked irritably if a couple of errands had already turned them into friends, Alex was puzzled. Alan shrugged and explained that trusting strangers was exactly what one would expect in the end. Soon he left the ship captured by his people and returned to his own. There his subordinates were already waiting for him, lined up in a row. Stopping in front of one of them, he threw the scalp he had recently taken from Alex onto the floor and ordered Paul to deal with it as usual. He lifted the bloody skin and looked at Alan with confusion when he asked if there was anything else he could do. Meeting his gaze, the pirate leader shook his head and told Paul to go get Maria, who turned around and immediately ran to carry out the order. Alan sighed heavily, thinking how tired he was of messing around with these fools. A few minutes later, Paul's voice was heard again, shouting that he had brought Maria. A dark-haired girl in a white coat and glasses covering half her face came forward to him. her voice trembling with fear. She asked why she had been called. He nodded and replied that he had heard that they had a new job and asked the girl for details. She, hesitating a little, explained that she was supposed to meet her friend today, but for some reason he stopped getting in touch. Maria shrank from fear at the loud, disgruntled roar. Alan slapped the armrest and demanded with emphasis in his voice that she be more specific. Maria replied that a request had been received from a research ship under the command of Captain George Silos to dispose of a corpse. Upon hearing about the Silos family, Alan's face showed surprise, and he asked if they were really here. Noticing this, Maria asked if he had heard anything about this family. He sighed tiredly, and folding his arms across his chest, replied that this was the third family among the Titans, after which he asked whose body they had ordered. When he heard that the body belonged to a woman from the Yu family, he narrowed his eyes in displeasure. At the end, Maria added that during the last call, they were promised 1,000,000 credits as a reward. The amount she named amused Alan, and sighing, he said that they were simply crazy. It didn't take a rocket scientist to immediately spot a conspiracy, especially considering that the atmosphere in the megacorporation has been rather unusual lately. He even heard rumors that the young Silos family from Mars had challenged the Yu family, the old king of Earth. The main business of the Silos family was the development of ships, but more attention was paid to genetic modification without the knowledge of the main families. And if the body of the deceased really belongs to the Yu family, it should be genetically modified, in which case they may well try to transfer the body to the Silos. By his calculations, this family would probably want to get the body for no less than 10,000,000 credits. The plan that had matured in his head smelled of big profits. For the sake of money, he was even ready to leave behind his grudge against the Silos, who made him the mutant Hulk. Looking at the girl in front of him, he asked what happened to that ship. Were they really attacked? She answered uncertainly that she did not know the details of what happened. Hearing her answer, he chuckled and assumed that they must be somewhere nearby. Then he rose from his seat and announced to everyone that as soon as they gathered, they would immediately go to George Silas's ship. Everyone in the hall let out a joyful cry and went to prepare for the coming attack. He also ordered them to blow up the previously captured ship so as not to leave any unnecessary traces behind. Half an hour later, their ship set off for its new destination. Alan's subordinates successfully planted a detonator on the ship they had captured. When the pirates were far enough away, the explosives that had been planted emitted a loud squeak, warning that they would explode in a few seconds. The flash of the explosion destroyed the entire ship in literally 1 instant. Edgar tensed as he sensed the strangers. He immediately guessed that these were the same pirates with whom Richard had made an agreement. Touching the floor, our hero activated the connection. Just like last time, his energy spread through all the wires of the ship, transmitting all the necessary information to him. Thanks to this, he was able to accurately determine the location of the enemies, who were currently drilling through the outer wall of the research ship to penetrate inside. His guess turned out to be correct, and a few minutes later the pirates were burning a hole in the wall of one of Edward's lairs. Once everything was ready, Greg kicked out the cut-out piece of metal. Afterwards, he and his group went inside. Edward felt that right now, the pirates were heading for the bridge. And judging by their characteristics, his enemies were real professionals in battle, and all their actions were honed to the point of automatism. When they started to cut another door in the wall, the hero tried to guess how stupid or smart these guys were, because even someone with the initial inclinations of ingenuity would immediately notice that this ship looks too strange. But when they knocked out another piece of the wall, he realized that the pirates were simply blinded by greed and did not notice anything except treasures. However, what awaited them in the next room still attracted the attention of these guys. They walked inside the dark room, carefully examining the walls and ceilings covered with strange green vines. After contacting their captain, they reported that they had successfully taken control of the bridge, but that something was wrong with this ship. When Alan asked what exactly was wrong, Brooke replied with puzzlement that they had not met a single person on board and that there were strange trees growing everywhere. What he heard enraged Alan, crushing the fragile glass of the wine glass in his fist. He shouted that Brooke should not take him for an idiot who would believe that a plant would suddenly grow in space. When Brooke said that everything he said was the absolute truth, Alan, who was in a real rage, stood up from his seat and headed towards the exit, saying that he would come himself and check everything, and that Brooke had better start saying goodbye to his head. In the shortest possible time, he gathered people and, dressed in his combat suit, he entered the alien ship. This did not go unnoticed by our hero. In Alan, Edgar easily recognized the leader of the pirates. Afterwards, he started testing other members of his team. One of them was an insect man who could control the pheromones coming out of his body. Next came a cyborg from the Star Union with a mechanical sound instead of a heartbeat. Our hero liked the news that the pirate crew consisted of various races, before it was not even possible for him to kill 10 creatures from each race except for humans. But now he can quite easily fulfill all the conditions for a new evolution. Suddenly, something else caught his attention. The girl walking behind everyone seemed terribly strange to him for an ordinary person. Looking at her, he had the feeling that there was a computer in her head instead of a brain. Deciding that it was time for him to visit a certain big shot, Edgar rose from his seat. When Ray asked where he was going, he replied that he needed to go away for a while and asked her to stay there because where he was going was too dangerous. Pointing to the cannon behind her, the hero ordered her to protect this weapon. Ray jumped up and down happily, saying that Edgar could rely on her, after which he left. The hero moved at full speed, fully understanding that now was his only chance to weaken the enemy's borders. For this, he needed to destroy the enemy ship's power source and block all escape routes. Edgar knew full well that these guys were driven by greed, so they would try to protect both the research ship and their own warship, and perhaps even split into groups. His hunt would begin when all the pieces were in place. Having encountered an obstacle in the form of a buried door, the hero used brute force to wedge himself between the doors. Then, with one powerful jerk, he opened them. Having freed himself from the interfering obstacle, he freely passed inside the enemy ship. Looking around, Edgar got the impression that there was no security system at all here, because the pirates could hardly have imagined that one day they would come to rob them themselves. Deciding not to waste time, he activated his superpowers. Thanks to this, he was able to determine the location of the nuclear reactor in a matter of seconds. Luckily for him, he was not far from here. He did not encounter any difficulties on his intended route except for humanoid robots located in almost every corridor of the ship. They will immediately warn the central system as soon as they detect an alien invasion. Edgar wondered how he could get past them without getting caught. After a minute of thought, an idea came to his mind, and he licked his lips greedily, deciding that the first thing he should do was go and grab a bite to eat. Having decided on his plan, the hero ran forward. Feeling someone's presence nearby, he stopped abruptly. Just around the bend, there were two patrolmen. One of them was an ordinary man, and the other was an insect man, and he decided to have some fun with them. Edgar waited until they got closer. As soon as this happened, he immediately attacked the man walking in front with his tail. The insect man froze in shock as his partner's head was suddenly cut off by someone. It took him a couple of seconds to realize what had just happened. Then he reached for the radio, intending to report the attack. But suddenly, something wrapped around his hand with the radio, preventing him from doing what he had planned. The pirate cried out in pain as Edgar cut off his arm. It flew to the side and fell to the floor with a bang. The insect man himself began to run, tearfully begging Edgar, who was pursuing him, for mercy. Catching up with him, he hit his opponent in the stomach with his head, knocking him off his feet. After this, he grabbed his victim's limbs with his many paws, tearing him apart, and the two front paws fell on his shoulder and head. With one powerful jerk, Edgar tore off the pirate's head. Throwing it aside, he began to eat the soft entrails of his dead victim. By eating them, the hero confirmed his assumption that eating an alien species does not help to replenish everything that is missing for its evolution. When a voice came from a nearby radio asking for a situation report, Edgar tore himself away from the body and reached for the device. Imitating the voice of the victim he had just eaten, he replied that everything was fine and hung up. After that, he began to open another locked door using his physical strength. The iron quickly gave way under his onslaught, allowing him passage. Edgar walked slowly into the rather cluttered room, glad that he wouldn't have to fight robots. He lifted the mattress and threw it aside and began to peer closely at the floor, because he felt very well that the radiator was somewhere here. Having found nothing, he covered one hand with his acid, after which he flooded the floor in front of him with it. Within moments, the acid had completely eaten away the floor beneath it, revealing to Edgar a view of the nuclear reactor, carefully guarded by robots. The hero's eyes sparkled with satisfaction, thinking that if there had been a person in their place, he would have immediately discovered that something was happening here. But since they were robots, not prepared to solve such non-standard problems, the task for him was significantly easier. Smiling broadly, he released a new portion of acid from his palm downwards. Meanwhile, on board the plane hijacked by pirates, a video recording was turned on, which showed many people missing some part of their body. When the recording revealed that their group leader was dead, someone started laughing hysterically, realizing that they were all going to meet the same end. Alan watched what was happening there with shock frozen on his face. His subordinates were in the same state and could not tear their eyes away from the monitor. Meanwhile, the picture changed again. The room filled with white smoke, followed by frightened screams from different sides, announcing that it had penetrated inside. Some viewers couldn't stand it and grabbed their heads, trying to understand what was happening in the video. Alan himself had been asking himself this question all this time. From the very beginning, he noticed strange green plants everywhere and the complete absence of people on the ship. All this led him to the idea that this was a ghost ship. In order to gather more information, he asked his man to play the footage from the cameras. But so far all they saw were people without limbs or with limbs but not in their right minds. Alan didn't know what or who these people were fighting, but the fact that they were all in such a terrible state was truly terrifying. Turning to Rob, he asked to turn on some earlier recording, and he immediately accepted the order for execution. A few moments later, the screen showed a recording of the moment when the reconnaissance squad was sent into the ventilation pipes under the command of Richard. Looking at him, Alan guessed that this man was most likely the one responsible for protecting the ship, and the second man was the captain. It also didn't escape Alan's keen eye that the entire management was in a panic, and their entire workforce was out of action for some reason. He watched the events unfolding on camera, his eyes widening in shock. Some creature with glowing scarlet eyes jumped straight from the ceiling, attacking one of the men. Next came the scene of Richard taking out a laser gun and starting to fire it at the monster. The camera even captured the monster smiling slyly while holding a fire extinguisher in its paws. From what he saw in these shots, Alan concluded that this creature had intelligence, which made it many times more dangerous. Suddenly, the picture changed again, and everyone saw how wings appeared from behind the monster, and he rushed towards Richard at full speed. After showing the last seconds of the man's life, the recording ended. Alan's thoughts became more and more gloomy. If he was originally worried about how he would deal with the Yu family, now he was worried about how he would carry his body out of here safe and sound. He called out to the girl standing near the screen. But I was still under the strong impression of what I saw and didn't hear anything at all. Then Alan had to call her name again, but much louder. This time Maria heard him and shuddered in surprise. After that, Alan asked when she lost contact with her friend. She, lowering her head, answered that it was yesterday. They initially planned to meet yesterday and discuss all the details, but the ship never arrived at the meeting place. The pirate captain listened to her carefully, trying to put the picture together. He had already figured out most of the details of the research ship on the way here. But the main problem was still that they knew practically nothing about this creature that had destroyed the entire crew. A smile appeared on his face as he guessed that it was highly likely that the monster didn't yet know they were here, since they had managed to get onto this ship almost silently. Nodding to himself, he shouted out that they had to find and kill this monster. Only after that would they go looking for the body of the woman from the M family. He was interrupted by the agitated voice of one of his subordinates, who informed him that they had a serious problem. He sighed with displeasure and asked what the problem was. Ivan hesitated, not afraid to speak further. But when his answer finally came, and Alan heard that their ship's engine was broken, he was truly perplexed. Stepping forward, he angrily asked what it meant to be broken, since a couple of hours ago it had been working without any problems. Ivan hesitantly explained that the engine was completely melted and could not be repaired. Hearing this, Alan angrily slammed his prosthetic arm onto the table surface. He was filled with rage that some creature had dared to damage his precious ship. Watching the enraged captain, Maria fell to the floor and cowered in fear. Having come to his senses a little, Alan called out to the girl, causing her to almost jump up from his commanding tone. When he asked if she could pilot the ship, the girl hesitantly replied that she could try, but she didn't know for sure if she could handle it. He cursed loudly and couldn't help but release a blast that flew right behind Maria, causing a strong gust of wind. Under his furious gaze, the girl shouted that she could control the ship. Pointing to his 3 guys, Alan ordered them to help her figure everything out, and instructed the rest to follow him in search of the monster. By this time, Edgar had already managed to return to his lair and activate his hypersensitivity. The hero immediately realized how angry the pirate captain was, which made him incredibly happy. He was even more amused by the thought that the pirates did not yet know that there were still survivors on this ship, although there were only about 20 of them, including the ship's captain and some of the surviving members of the leadership. Edgar did not spare them out of the kindness of his heart. He knew very well that a battle would soon break out between them, because Captain George hated pirates. Our hero planned to take advantage of this opportunity and carry out his plan. Besides that, he knew that there were currently 3 pirates and a girl posing as normal left on the bridge. This would be a great chance to attack them, but he had too bad a feeling about it. Amorph's instinct told him that this strange girl was too dangerous, and he should stay away from her. Suddenly, he remembered Richard's words about a monster like Edward, who uses many abilities, his mistress, Maria Yu. The hero scratched his head thoughtfully, trying to understand what it was about her that made Richard say the words about their similarity. To him, she looked more like a genetically modified person. But considering that this girl was from the M family, who are obsessed with the idea of prolonging life, there is a high probability that she was changed much more than Alexa Y. And if she Maria was changed to the player's level, then it will be very difficult for him to defeat her, even if he evolves to a young individual. It had been too long since he had last fought a genetically modified human, so seeing such a powerful opponent again both excited and scared him at the same time. Ivan walked with his comrades through the dark corridors of the plane and cowered in fear at the slightest rustle. The recordings he had seen had too strong an effect on him. Alan walked behind the line, exuding a simply murderous aura. Suddenly, Mark, who was walking ahead, stopped when the device in his palm began to make a faint beep and looked at it in surprise. He then turned his puzzled gaze to the captain, who asked what had happened, and he replied that the motion sensor had detected people. Alan growled in displeasure, asking for more details. Mark said that the sensor points to the captain's cabin of this ship, but the way there is blocked, so he suggested drilling a hole in the nearest wall. When Alan said with undisguised displeasure that he was surrounded by nothing but cretins, the men trembled with fear before him, knowing full well what their captain was capable of when he was out of sorts. He slammed his prosthesis against his fist and said emphatically that there was no need to ask his permission for such obvious things, but to just take them and do them right away, without wasting any extra time. His team members immediately got to work. Howard quickly wielded the tool and in a matter of moments cut a hole in the closed doors. After this, Mark knocked out a piece of metal with one kick, opening the way for himself and the others. Hearing another beep, he immediately stared at the sensor screen. It was this action that became his fatal mistake. Someone's shot smashed his head. All the other team members following him immediately pressed themselves against the wall, saving themselves from further enemy attacks. When it all stopped, the Mantis Man sighed with relief, glad that he was not the one walking ahead. Alan burst into the room at full speed, his eyes blazing with rage. His fist immediately flew with all its force into the head of his first target. Painting the floor and walls red, the man's head, unable to withstand the impact, flew off his neck. Roaring furiously, Alan killed people one after another, spilling rivers of blood. The guard who tried to counterattack the enemy died one of the last, an incredibly brutal death. The man hung like a limp doll with his chest pierced by Alan's prosthesis. As the pirate threw his body aside, the surviving doctor screamed in horror. Alan walked slowly towards him. He held his palm out in front of him, shouting that he surrendered and would not resist. In response to this, Alan flexed his wrists and growled that their cartel never accepts the wounded. Without giving up trying to save their lives, the man admitted that he was the head of the medical team of this ship and could be useful. Hearing this, Alan's expression changed, and he said that if this was really so, then he must be aware of where the captain himself was and what they were all doing in his cabin. Instead of answering, Patrick only gritted his teeth, holding back his irritation. But he managed to quickly pull himself together, and after clearing his throat, he said that the captain had headed towards the rescue ship. When Alan asked with disbelief in his voice if it was true that George had done something like this, abandoning his crew to their fate, the head of the medical team replied that he did not know more, nor where their captain had gone after that. The pirate sighed heavily, thinking that the situation was far from being for the better. His ship had been destroyed by a monster, and the only person who knew the location of the body was on the rescue ship. Suddenly, a new idea entered his head, and he turned his gaze back to Patrick. Leaning over him, he said with a menacing voice that since he was a doctor, he should know where the body of the woman from the M family was. When the man replied that the body belonged to a monster, Alan clicked his tongue in displeasure. He was annoyed that this monster had been mentioned too often in the last hour. Slamming his fist against the wall next to Peter's head, he asked why the monster needed a dead body. The medic, cowering in fear, replied that the creature ate people. Alan realized that if this man was really telling the truth, then they had very little time left. Turning around, he shouted to his group to split up and immediately find the body that the monster had dragged away. If they had any problems, they should report it immediately. They went to carry out his order without question. Then he looked at Peter again and said that it just so happened that they needed a doctor on the team. When he asked the man if he knew anything about genetic remodeling, he smiled tightly and replied that he had encountered it many times and they could completely rely on him. Thus, the remnants of the original crew were destroyed and only one person managed to survive, joining the pirates. Edward, aware of everything that was happening there, was greatly disappointed that it all ended much faster than he expected. He put his finger to his chin and thought that he should have expected this from the mutant Hulk. Now our hero switched to observing one of the two groups of 6 people each. Deciding that it was time for him to move on, he stood up from his usual place, Ray realized that Edgar was going somewhere again and jumping towards him. She said that she would go with him, but he put his palm in front of him, telling her to wait for him here. As she persisted in her insistence, the thought flashed through our hero's mind that Ray's behavior now resembled that of a child who wanted to help his father. Watching her huff and puff, Edgar decided that he should give Ray a chance to prove herself in battle. Even if she couldn't help him in the end, he couldn't stop her desire. Sighing, he reached out to her and carefully lifted her into his arms. She immediately climbed onto his shoulder, and, in response to his warning about the danger, she happily replied that she would be extremely careful. Immediately after this, they left their lair. Meanwhile, the first group of pirates stopped at one of the closed doors to cut their way further. Julian, standing to the side, looked around and asked in bewilderment where this jungle had come from, and what kind of monster it must be if it could even grow jungle all the way to the ceiling along the entire perimeter of the plane. While working on the door, Victor called out to his partners and said that they needed to get rid of those green vines so he could set up his flame installation. Killian stepped forward and slashed at one of the green trunks with his sword. Green liquid immediately gushed out of the stumps and landed on Kane, who was standing nearby. He glanced sideways at Killian with displeasure and asked if he had done it on purpose. He grinned, looking at the green liquid on his blade, and replied that it would be a reason for Kane to take an extra bath. Victor hurried these blockheads in a displeased tone, reminding them that they had little time. Killian wanted to answer him something, but suddenly noticed how something strange began to happen with his sword. Right before his eyes, his sword began to melt rapidly. At that very moment, Kane grabbed his face and let out a heart-rending scream, causing confusion among the rest of the team. His face, as well as Killian's blade, was rapidly melting under the action of the acid, which penetrated right to his skull. Killian recoiled in horror as his partner fell to the floor, dead. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound behind him, and he immediately turned around to check what it was. As soon as he did so, his stomach was pierced by Edgar's powerful paw. The pirates, standing a couple of meters away from them, froze in horror. The monster in front of them was significantly different from what they saw in the recordings. They grabbed their weapons and began firing at the enemy, intending to kill him. But thanks to his tough skin, no bullets could harm Edgar now. Pushing off the floor with his hind legs, he leapt forward through the hail of bullets flying at him. A couple of seconds later, death cries were heard in the corridor again, and blood began to flow like a river. Edgar mercilessly killed one pirate after another, wielding his spiked tentacles. The Mantis Man managed to hold out longer than anyone else only because of his agility. But when Ray attacked him, he didn't have time to dodge. The pirate fell to the floor and began to writhe his whole body, trying to get rid of the amoeba that had latched onto his head. Suddenly, Edgar's attention was drawn to a voice behind him. One of the pirates contacted someone on the radio and, shaking with fear, shouted that there was a monster here and they needed to go back. At that moment, the hero sank his teeth into the man's head, causing him to cry out in pain. Having gotten rid of it, Edgar reached for the radio lying on the floor, from which someone's voice was coming. Imitating the voice of the pirate he had just killed, the hero said that he had made a mistake and that there was no one here. When he was met with a barrage of angry curses, Edgar apologized for the false alarm and hung up. Turning the radio over in his hand, he decided that he should keep it with him, because it could still be very useful to him in distracting the enemy's attention. He then returned to the pirate's mangled body, who was miraculously still alive even after losing half of his body. Edgar theorized that it was because he was a cyborg from the Star Union. Unlike the mega corporation that enhances and modifies genes, the Star Union believes in replacing weak human bodies with machines. Their main problem was that they forced their beliefs on other races, and any species that fell into their hands would be immediately changed beyond recognition, regardless of their will and desires. Edgar opened his mouth, deciding that even though this pirate was made of iron, he could still try to eat him. As his teeth closed on his neck, several small fasteners flew down. After chewing the first of his heads, Edgar noted that the cyborg had a rather interesting taste. Due to the fact that half of the body was a machine, it had a strong, coppery taste of oil. While finishing the remains of the pirate, the hero was distracted by a blue window that suddenly appeared in front of him. It said that part of the conditions for evolution into a teenage individual had been fulfilled. He only had to absorb 9 more creatures of the new intelligent race. After studying this message, Edgar immediately remembered that there should be about 12 pirate cyborgs on this ship, and if he ate them, he could immediately move on to the next stage of evolution. Suddenly, Ray jumped on his shoulder and asked what he was worried about. He replied that she didn't need to know that yet. Afterwards, they moved on together in search of the second group of pirates. It took him only a couple of minutes to catch up. The Sandman tried to fight off the enemy with all his might, continuously firing from the cannon. Not paying attention to this, Edgar got as close to the pirate as possible and grabbed his head with his paw. In one movement, he tore her away from her body along with her spine. Then he brought the severed head closer to himself, peering at it. In this way, he was able to eliminate 2 teams of pirates. Looking towards the remains of his victims, Edgar thought with regret that 3 cyborgs had managed to escape. He slowly approached the remains of the robot people's bodies, thinking that they looked the same as the cyborg from the first group. Everything had melted except for the legs. The hero grabbed the leg that remained of the cyborg, deciding that perhaps he should try to absorb it. Guided by these thoughts, he bit off half of the leg, which consisted entirely of iron. No matter how hard he tried, Edgar couldn't eat it, so he just spat it all back out, and besides, he also didn't get any of the predation effect at all. The hero assumed that the reason was that he was not the one who killed this victim. Thinking about this, he turned his gaze to Ray, who was now actively absorbing her victim. A few moments before the cyborg would have finally died, he pierced his body with his tail. Ray immediately got off her victim and approached Edgar and asked if he was hungry. He pointed at the pirate he had just killed and said that he personally had to kill everyone who looked like that. Afterwards, he pointed to the bodies nearby, saying that she could take care of them for now. She understood him and jumped in the direction indicated. He himself sank down next to the cyborg's body, mentally apologizing to Ray for taking away her sacrifice, but he had no other choice. Suddenly, a voice came from the device attached to the man's shoulder, asking for a report on the situation around him. Other squads immediately began to respond, reporting that everything was clear for them. When it was his turn, Edgar said that they were currently searching for the arsenal, but the bottom was also all clear. Having said this, he began to bite into the flesh of his victim, listening to further reports. Hearing the dissatisfied voice of the signalman, who was expecting to hear a report from the team that had gone to the laboratory, Edgar reconnected with the conversation and replied that everything was clean there too, which caused bewilderment in his interlocutor, who said that another team was responsible for that place. After thinking for a moment, Edgar replied that those guys were busy with something else right now. After that, he switched off, noting that these guys were too smart for pirates. He glanced back at Ray worriedly, checking that she was nearby. He still found it hard to believe that he was hanging out with this bubble amoeba. If the gaming community found out about this, they would just go crazy. After all, Amorph is a creature that specializes in acting alone. Once upon a time, Edgar himself was not a friendly person, keeping away from everyone else. After receiving reports from all the reconnaissance groups he had sent, Alan had a strange premonition. He had always been strict about reporting duties due to his military background, and now some idiot has broken his established rules, knowing full well what punishment would follow. His instincts were screaming that this was a trap, and that something had definitely happened to one of the squads. Contacting the groups again, he ordered everyone to go to the lab and check what was going on there. After this, he turned to Peter, asking where the rescue ship and engine room were on this ship. He pointed towards the hole in the wall and asked Alan to follow him. He clenched his fist, thinking that now that his warship was out of action, he needed to think of other escape routes. But before that, he planned to plant a bomb in the engine room on the nuclear engine. Even a small bomb would have been enough for the job. Once he gets away from here, he can get rid of both this ship and the monster that lives here with one click of a button. He was sorry to leave his people on this ship, but Alan was sure that there were still plenty of idiots in space ready to taste the pirate life. He planned to take only 2 people with him, Maria and the doctor. He didn't need anyone else. While thinking about this, he called out to Peter, who, hearing his name, became very frightened and immediately responded to the captain's call. He asked if he knew any details about the monster that had taken over the ship, or even its weakness. When he shook his head, saying that he did not have such information, Alan frowned with displeasure. Noticing this, Tony swung his machine gun at Peter and threatened that he should tell them the truth, to which the man replied in a voice trembling with horror that he was not lying and really did not know anything. Alan looked the doctor over appraisingly. Understanding his cowardly nature perfectly well, it was not difficult for him to understand that Peter was much more afraid of that monster and would not say a word to them. Then he decided to approach it from a different angle and asked what power and abilities this monster had, to which Peter replied that it moved like a ghost. When Alan asked what it meant, the man explained that the monster devoured a person in the blink of an eye and left no trace behind. Even they did not immediately notice the losses in their ranks for quite a long time. In response to this, the pirate captain said that it was because they were being run by complete idiots. But Peter shook his head, saying that the entire ship was filled with security sensors from top to bottom, and with them in place. The monster avoided them all without ever getting caught, which is something only a ghost could do. Alan found it hard to believe that these words were true, because Peter's story sounded terribly absurd. But just in case, he decided to warn his guys. After contacting them, the captain informed everyone that plans had changed. Edgar also heard that Alan suggested that everyone gather and discuss everything before entering the laboratory. The hero realized that his opponent was quite smart, since he didn't fall for his imitation, which easily fooled people. But even so, it was already too late, because the pirates had already gathered in one place long ago. This time, Edgar was going to attack them all at once. He leaned his forehead against the green wall and connected his auxiliary limbs to it. Thus, with the help of the branches that were distributed throughout the ship, his cognitive skills were greatly expanded. The flow of his feelings rushes through his consciousness, taking control of the corridors and rooms of the ship. It only took him a couple of minutes for the auxiliary organ connection to be fully completed, and now the pirates were literally in our hero's stomach. Noticing that something was happening, the pirates began to look around in bewilderment. When Edgar released the paralytic spores, a pungent, foul smell spread throughout the corridor, which the pirates could not help but notice. Some people had an immediate reaction to the gas they inhaled. Someone had not yet had time to breathe in the poisoned air and started running. But eventually, the paralytic poison caught up with them too, not allowing the pirates to escape far. After that, Edgar detached himself from the green stem, thinking that when he became a juvenile, he would be able to use the nest's facilities more freely. Today, he tried this method out of pure curiosity, but it was definitely worth it. Suddenly, he felt a strong weakness. This technique had taken too much energy from him. He headed towards the exit of the den to go and get some food, and Ray immediately followed him. Sometime later, our heroes came to the corridor where the entrance to the laboratory was located. Edward grabbed the first pirate body he came across. Bringing it closer, he sank his teeth into the soft flesh, tearing off a tasty piece. He assumed that the pirates would abandon their comrades here, saving their lives. Edgar was not at all against this arrangement, because this way he would not have to waste extra time fighting for his food. While he was filling his stomach, Ray jumped on his back, simultaneously swallowing some poor guy's hand. When he checked the system window, he saw that 5 of the people he had killed here were cyborgs, and now he only needed to kill 2 more to fulfill all the conditions. He examined the bodies of the pirates, looking for the 2 he needed. Realizing that a few had managed to escape, he looked at the door leading to the training hall. He could feel them there, but he didn't understand what motivated their choice. After some thought, Edgar came to the conclusion that the pirates were most likely hoping for a clearer view and better aiming angles, since it was much more spacious than the other rooms. But the problem was that the members of this crew thought the same, so our hero was sure that the pirates saw what outcome awaited their predecessors. He personally turned the place where bonds with comrades were strengthened into a bloody place of slaughter. Coming close to the iron door, Edgar could clearly feel the uneven breathing of the pirates, who were shocked by what they saw. Stroking Ray, who was sitting on his shoulder, the hero asked her to hide behind him, because it would be too dangerous to continue. He used his claws to break through the tightly closed doors, pushing them apart. One sharp jerk was enough for him to get rid of the obstacle and get inside. But the pirates were already prepared for his invasion, and immediately many fiery flashes flew at him. They hit our hero's body with a dull thud, causing him absolutely no harm. The man firing the cannon was shocked and confused when he realized this. Then he decided to change his plan of action. A moment later, a laser blade appeared in his palm instead of the guns. Having put it in front of him, the pirate asked Edgar if he even knew who was standing in front of him, and, without waiting for an answer, shouted out that he was the deputy commander-in-chief of Alan. He began to swing the blade chaotically in front of him, trying to scare the monster away. Our hero was in no hurry to attack. Using his hypersensitivity, he managed to figure out that this was a sonic sword, and it could damage his shell. He looked over the pirate's body with a searching gaze, looking for his weak points, of which, fortunately for him, the man had many. Edgar opened his mouth wide and rushed at the pirate. He immediately held his sword in front of him and confidently said that this was how the monster would meet its end. However, everything went completely differently than he imagined. Our hero's pointed tail pierced his stomach. Because of this, the pirate was unable to stay on his feet and fell to the floor with a crash. Hellish pain did not allow him to move. The only thing he could do was to put the blade in front of himself as self-defense. Edgar was surprised by the endurance of this man. Usually all his victims immediately lost consciousness or died, and this one was still trying to resist him. As a reward for his persistence, the hero decided to give him a quick death, and the next moment pierced his head with his tail. After this, the pirate fell down dead. Edgar dropped down next to him and began to eat his body. He was sure that the other 4 escapees were hiding in the locker room. Suddenly, the system window appeared in front of him again. The hero frowned when he read that by obtaining the genetic data of the absorbed victim, he gained a skill called human nature. While devouring the pirate's body, Edgar couldn't stop thinking about what kind of skill this was, because its name made it too difficult to determine what it was. Although he was in no position to be picky, the hero was tormented by doubts about whether he should accept this skill or whether it would be better to refuse it. There were over 1,000 different skills in the game, but not all of them were useful. For example, if we take the Mutant Hulk's Rampage stat, they can gain twice as many physical skills, but they lose the ability to control themselves. Therefore, he feared that this skill would be one of those whose disadvantages greatly outweighed the advantages. Some skills with such ambiguous names were often lethal in a game that was a complete dystopia full of evil creatures. But the main evil was the Star Alliance, which kidnapped people and turned them into robots, and a mega corporation that created monsters by modifying genes. The entire universe of this game was built on the idea that such creatures would be far superior to human civilization. So a skill that gives an evil creature human-like qualities greatly alarmed our hero. If he takes this skill and his human emotions take over, he will become significantly weakened, like Amorph, who is forced to feed on humans. So for his own safety, he decided to refuse. At that very moment, his entire body seemed to be pierced by a powerful flash of lightning. He looked down at the tiny, vibrating tentacles growing from his chin. Edgar realized that in this way his auxiliary image was forcing him to reconsider his decision. Usually, these little tentacles had never failed him before. Deciding to trust them, he pressed the agree button. As soon as he did so, a blinding white flash of light filled the room. She disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. The hero listened to his feelings, but did not notice any changes at all. Then he looked at his body and felt his head, checking if something was coming out of it, but also found nothing. A few moments later, a blue window appeared in front of him again, where a list of available types was presented. Noticing under the type of enhancing superpowers his new skill, Edgar assumed that it was somehow related to mental abilities. Having called up another window, he read the description of the ability itself, and it was written there that at the moment of choice, it helps to make the right decision. Our hero was confused and did not know how to properly relate to this skill. He sighed tiredly and closed all the windows, deciding that now he would just focus on fulfilling all the conditions to obtain a new type. At that moment, Ray called out to him, asking if he was okay. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. The amoeba explained that all this time he stood without moving and looked very strange. Edgar sighed and pulled her onto his shoulder, leaving her question unanswered. After that, he moved on. He could smell everyone lurking in the room and wasn't going to let his victims get away this time. Robert heard the desperate cries of his comrades and the crunch of their breaking bones as the monster devoured one pirate after another. The man sincerely did not understand what he had done to deserve all this, because compared to others, he led a more righteous life. Suddenly, he heard the monster's footsteps approaching the lockers he was hiding in. Robert pressed the machine gun tighter to his body, trying not to even breathe so as not to give away his presence. He could only pray that Alan would get here before they were all eaten alive. Edgar opened cabinet after cabinet looking for his victim. But when the next locker was empty, he turned away in disappointment and headed in the opposite direction. Hearing the footsteps receding, Robert breathed a sigh of relief, glad that his prayers had been answered. He relaxed and lowered his weapon, promising himself that as soon as this was over, he would run away wherever his eyes looked or even defect to the Star Union. The pirate waited a few seconds, then leaned forward slightly, peering through the gaps in the door. Suddenly, his eyes widened in shock as a sharp pain shot through his body. Looking down, he saw that the monster's tail had broken through the closet door and was embedded in his stomach. As soon as his tail disappeared, Edgar's paws poked through the hole. Having freed himself from the flimsy barrier, our hero rushed at the pirate. He screamed in horror at the top of his lungs and begged not to do it, seeing how the monster's mouth opened wide, but Edgar ignored all of this, enjoying his fear. In the end, only a couple of metal parts remained of Robert, which were immediately thrown aside by the heroes. It didn't take him long to absorb the cyborg's body. Edgar was very happy with the thought that all he had to do was find the last pirate, and then he would finally be able to evolve. But the problem was that he was on the bridge in the head section. That strange girl he wants to avoid at all costs is there too. As he left the training room, he decided that his first priority should be the pirate captain. He suddenly stopped, feeling his auxiliary tentacles vibrate again. Only thanks to them he managed to avoid a surprise attack by the enemy in time. Edgar dodged and jumped onto the ceiling. Below him stood an enraged Alan, who was already aware that not only his men, but also his deputy had been killed. Our hero was surprised because he did not expect at all that the enemy would find him first, although in some sense it was even for the better. The mutant Hulk was equipped with useful genes that he was able to absorb from Edgar before he headed to the command bay. Looking behind Alan, he noticed the temporary replacement head of the medical team, who had managed to defect to the pirates. The hero jumped down, deciding that it was not the most important thing now, because this little man would have ended up in his stomach anyway. He glanced at Ray, who was shaking with fear, and ordered her to hide. She instantly jumped off his shoulder and jumped to the side. Thanks to its properties, it managed to become transparent and merge with the wall. Calling out to Edgar, she asked him to be careful. Now that Ray was relatively safe, our hero turned his full attention to his enemy. Alan turned out to be more intimidating than he imagined, his large height giving him an advantage coupled with his incredible speed. Although at first glance it may seem that he simply does not have a single chance after such an opponent, because among other things, Alan was an improved mutant. Edgar was confident that he would be able to find a loophole and emerge victorious. Meanwhile, the pirates remaining in the main compartment watched everything that was happening at the laboratory through cameras. The men talked quietly among themselves, fighting the urge to go to the aid of their captain. Rudolph looked towards Maria and asked how much longer she had left. She replied that almost everything was ready. Hearing her answer, he asked irritably why this piece of iron was taking so long. The girl explained that it was a ship of an old generation megacorporation, but it had advanced AI. This ship was practically the pinnacle of space and computer engineering, so everything here was much more complicated than in a regular new generation ship. Rudolph sighed heavily and asked her to speed up, returning back to watching the cameras. The girl herself turned her gaze back to the monitors, appreciating Richard's work. With her X-ray vision, she saw the monster in the recording use a smokescreen to trick him and win. She understood that this monster was not just smart, since he also managed to rob the laboratory and absorb all the gene samples there. According to the reports she found in the database, this monster only stole samples, which meant that he knew how to use them for their intended purpose. Maria was 90% a monster, just like herself, who absorbed other people's genes and evolved. And if her guess is indeed correct, then Alan does not have long to live. All this time he was just a convenient puppet, obeying someone else's will without even knowing it. Her lips stretched into an anticipatory smile. Finally, something interesting was starting where she could have fun too. She stood up from her seat, deciding that there was no point in continuing this whole circus and reducing the number of genes that this monster could absorb in the near future. The unsuspecting pirates hurried the girl, saying that now they needed to hurry to their commander as quickly as possible. However, her next actions alerted Rudolph, and he unconsciously clutched his machine gun tighter. In fact, Mary had several names. As she took off her glasses and threw them aside, an incredibly sharp blade emerged from under the skin of her hand. The aura she gave off was incredibly terrifying, causing everyone in the megacorporation to call her the Spiral Witch, and the Yu family to know her as Shadow. This girl was the pearl of the Yu family's genetic engineering and the only blood heir to a long-forgotten bloodline. Meanwhile, Alan went on the attack. Edgar barely had time to dodge his attacks. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he tried to strike back at the man, but he quickly reacted, and his sharp claws swiped across the metal armor. Alan let out a terrifying roar, intending to make another lunge. Edgar jumped back and accidentally hit some installation with his tail. The next moment, his body was hit by powerful lightning strikes. When this torture finally ended, Edward felt as if his extrasensory organ had gone numb. Turning his gaze to his opponent, he mentally praised him. The hero understood why Alan threw him a pulse grenade, to check whether his opponent was a combat robot. Not satisfied with the result of his small experiment, the pirate leader said with displeasure that in that case the version with the new recruit from the Star Union was out of the question. When he asked Edgar if he understood him, he looked up at Alan in surprise. He pulled his mane back with his prosthetic, exposing part of his neck. The hero recognized the red button resting on his neck as a rage switch. Letting go of his fur, Alan admitted that he had installed a bomb in the reactor, and that the control panel was synchronized directly with his heart. He said that if he was killed, the ship would explode and everyone on board would die after him. Edward activated his abilities to check the veracity of these words. As far as he could judge from the doctor's reaction, Alan's words were indeed true. The only question was whether he would really dare to detonate the bomb. Looking at the enemy in front of him, the owner of high intelligence, super strong body, and impenetrable arrogance, he could confidently say that he valued his life. There was nothing in him that suggested he was ready to give up his own life so easily. However, contrary to Edgar's assumptions, Alan made a firm decision and pressed the button. Significant changes began to occur in his body, starting at the cellular level. Coughing up blood, Alan growled loudly from the pain tearing through his body. The skin on his body began to tear, and his muscles began to grow in size. A few agonizing moments later, Alan's entire body was transformed, increasing significantly in size. His face also lost its former features and acquired the appearance of a real monster. Throwing his hands up, he let out an even louder, more furious roar. Edgar watched him in amazement, thinking that Alan was truly terrible. Stuffing himself with more genes was only a small part of success. It was much more difficult to maintain his personality in the end. Judging by his current appearance, Edgar could tell without a doubt that he had the genes of a mountain crawler, which was even nicknamed a stone dragon due to its impenetrable, durable shell. Approaching our hero, Alan attacked him. He immediately ducked, dodging his opponent's fist. While Alan was open, he decided to take advantage of this and raised his sharp tail right above his chest to inject the poison. Only after barely scratching him did he stop, remembering the bomb that would explode immediately if his opponent died. Because of this delay, Edgar missed Alan's blow that fell on his head. The pirate was sure that he would kill his opponent with this blow, but seeing that this did not happen, bewilderment was reflected on his face. Under his fist was the still unharmed Edgar. Having crawled out from under it, our hero immediately rushed away from it. He, unable to contain his anger, hit the floor with his fist, cursing furiously. Once Edgar was a safe distance away from his opponent, he turned around and looked at Alan again. If the hero had not had such a strong shell, he would have gone to the next world long ago. Until that moment, he could not understand why the pirate mentioned the bomb, but apparently he specifically wanted Edgar to hit him in the chest. Accepting this challenge of unfair combat, the hero began to slowly retreat back, not taking his eyes off his opponent for a second. He realized that Edgar was up to something and said that all his attempts to do anything would be useless. But he ignored these words, continuing to carefully study Alan's body. Since he couldn't aim for the heart, he had to look for other options, of which he didn't have many. The armor surrounding the pirate's arms and legs was too strong, and there was no way he could break through it, even if he used a plasma weapon. Trying to attack Alan in open areas of the body would also be too risky. Edgar was sure that at the first opportunity, the pirate would simply grab him by the tail, which posed the greatest threat to him. When Alan got tired of waiting, he ran at his opponent again, leaving deep dents in the floor behind him. Edgar was in no hurry to dodge, realizing that his tail was not the only thing that was dangerous about him. He timed it right and jumped to the side, and Alan's punch landed on the floor. Our hero, meanwhile, like a fast shadow, rushed at full speed to the other end of the corridor and disappeared around the corner. Alan, roaring furiously, rushed after him, not lagging behind at all. Edgar continued to run further. Now he had a plan that was supposed to work 100%. With his supersonic sword and his ability to secrete poison from his fangs and claws, he planned to pierce Alan's indestructible armor. Noticing an open door ahead, the hero smiled predatorily. He ran into the cargo bay, where he first opened his eyes to this world. The pirate immediately ran into the storage room after him. Edgar knew one deep-seated weakness of the giant mutants and planned to hold out just a little while longer until it manifested itself. Alan had been running around the cargo bay and going on a rampage for several minutes now. From his terribly heavy steps, all the cockroaches rushed in different directions, saving their lives. The pirate continued to move forward, rummaging through everything in search of Edward. Having run behind one of the containers, the cockroaches climbed to the very top. Suddenly, someone's sharp claw pierced the body of one of them. Edgar, sitting in his hiding place, swallowed a cockroach. Now he didn't see the point in fighting Alan, who had such destructive power. Because of their peculiarity, giant mutants are fast and strong, but they spend too much energy, and therefore they have to take short breaks to rest from time to time. That's why he decided to wait until his opponent was exhausted and only then attack. In this way, about 15 more minutes passed, and Alan, unable to bear it any longer, growled furiously, ordering Edgar to immediately stop hiding and come out. He remained in the same place all this time, trying not to reveal his location ahead of time. All this time he had been assuming that since Alan had two hearts, which one had the detonator connected to it. As far as he knew, the mutant hulks had their main heart on the left side, so the detonator would most likely be connected to it. But he also understood that Alan could be cheating, and therefore the probability of his assumption being correct was 50%. His eyes widened in surprise when he heard a loud curse to his left. Only at the last moment did Edgar manage to jump away before Alan landed on the spot where he had been, raising a column of dust into the air. When the dust cleared, the pirate saw that his opponent had slipped away again. As Edgar jumped over the containers, he heard Alan's angry curses behind him. Suddenly, the pirate fell silent and began to breathe heavily, not moving from his place. The hero, who had managed to climb higher, noticed that something was finally starting to happen to his opponent. As Alan stood up and continued on his way, Edgar noticed that his speed had slowed considerably. He decided that this was the very right moment that simply could not be missed. So Edgar jumped down on Alan, taking advantage of the element of surprise. But his heightened instincts immediately screamed about danger. Bending down, the pirate grabbed a sharp shard from the stone slab. Then he instantly turned around and threw it at Edgar. He quickly ducked his head and the shard flew past, barely grazing one of his hands. Afterwards, he landed a couple of meters from Alan. He ran up to him with a deafening roar and raised his fists to strike. He hit Edgar on the head just as the hero jumped towards him. He had to grit his teeth hard from the pain. But this attack was worth it. Now he could use his trump card. Swinging his supersonic sword, he struck Alan in the arm, causing a significant portion of the dense armor to fall off. Afterwards, the hero opened his mouth wide and sank his teeth into the exposed area of skin. His poison instantly penetrated the pirate's body, mixing with the blood. He screamed in pain and began to spin from side to side, trying to throw Edgar off of himself. A few moments later, he finally managed to throw it off, and the hero flew into the wall, leaving a deep mark in it. Immediately after that, Alan raised his good hand to strike. But he couldn't take a step, feeling how something strange began to happen to his body. Noticing this, Edgar laughed loudly, causing bewilderment in the pirate. He looked at his hand, which he had bitten his opponent, and said in disbelief that this simply could not be. A slight tremor began to run through his entire body. His strength was rapidly leaving him, and at one point he staggered and fell to the floor with a crash. As soon as this happened, Edgar rose from his seat and rushed towards his opponent. As he lowered himself down next to Alan, he noticed that his paralysis was not working as effectively on him as it did on people, but it didn't bother him much. The pirate began to beg for mercy, realizing the hopelessness of his situation. But Edgar was deaf to his pleas and instead pierced his neck with his tail, injecting another dose of poison. After which he began to tear the hardened shell from his body with his claws, listening to Alan's heartbreaking screams. A few minutes later, he finally finished. As our hero had assumed, the detonator was attached to the second heart on the right, and apparently it was supposed to be activated not even by a signal, but by a strong blow. He was well aware that this heart controlled the side effects of the genetic modification, so it was hard to believe that Alan really wanted to drag him to the next world with him, knowing that without this heart, he simply would not survive. Carefully taking the detonator in his hands, he began to disassemble it in order to deactivate it, while Edgar wondered whether he would like the mutant Hulk genes. Suddenly, he heard Ray's worried voice behind him. Without being distracted from the matter, Edgar reminded her with displeasure that he had asked her to remain in the shadows and not to interfere, but she had shouted that danger was approaching here. Hearing this, he finally looked at Ray and asked her with confusion what she meant. However, he didn't need her explanations. Images of a terrible upcoming future instantly burst into his head, as had happened once before. Ray didn't have time to reach him because a powerful stream of flame cut her body into two parts. Then this flame spread to him. Left without all his arms, legs, and tail, Edward howled in terrible pain. The next moment, the picture before his eyes was replaced by a new one. Everywhere lay his body, cut into many pieces, in a pool of his own blood. What he saw made Edgar drop the detonator from his hands. He quickly came out of a state of shock, realizing that if he didn't do something now, the vision would become reality. Jumping off Alan's body, he picked up Ray in his arms. Together with her, he rushed as far away from that place as possible. A moment later, he felt the heat of the flame behind his back. The girl who entered the room said that for the first time she missed the target. Smiling broadly, Maria asked Edgar if he really had the ability to foresee the future. The hero tensed up his whole body, noticing how much the girl had changed. He suspected that something was wrong with her and wanted to deal with her last of all. But she came to him herself. From the blade sticking out of her hand, he determined that she had the white Galeron gene mixed with the genes of other high-level beings. The hero understood perfectly well that at his current level, he was not even close to being her rival. Just by looking at her, his whole being warned Edgar that he should not confront this creature and simply run away. Maria turned her gaze from the hero to Alan lying in front of her. There was surprise and bewilderment in his eyes. Still smiling, she said that he had done a good job and raised her hand, pointing the sharp blade at him. It instantly pierced the heart along with the detonator. After this, Maria raised her gaze to the frozen Edgar. He desperately tried to figure out what to do in this situation. He assumed that the bomb's timer had already been activated because he had not been able to deactivate the detonator, and attacking this girl directly now would be pure suicide. To do this, he needs to know what skills she has and what strategy she uses. The hero moved back cautiously when Maria said that she had one proposal for him. Taking a few steps towards him, she explained that Edgar was very similar to herself, so she was ready to save his life, but only on one condition. With a crooked smile on her lips, Maria said that he should become her pet and serve her faithfully.